The psychological analysis of Dutch Van Der Linde begins with a strange problem. Dutch is not hard to understand because he is empty. He is hard to understand because he is full of things that contradict each other. He is charming and cruel. He is idealistic and selfish. He is intelligent and delusional. He loves his people, but he also needs them to orbit him. He talks about freedom while demanding loyalty. He says he hates civilization, but he cannot live without an audience. He wants to be a father, a philosopher, a revolutionary, a king, and a victim all at once. That is why Dutch remains one of the most interesting characters in Red Dead Redemption 2. He is not simply a bad man pretending to be good. He is a man whose idea of goodness slowly becomes inseparable from his own ego. When players first meet Dutch in Red Dead Redemption 2, he is already under pressure. The Blackwater ferry job has gone terribly wrong. People are dead. The gang is freezing in the mountains. They are hungry, wounded, hunted, and afraid. Dutch is standing in the snow trying to hold the group together with words. That image tells us almost everything. Dutch's first weapon is not a revolver. It is not a plan. It is speech. He survives psychologically by narrating disaster in a way that makes him remain central, noble, and necessary. Dutch tells the gang they are safe, even when they are not. He tells them they just need money, even though money has never been enough. He tells them they will find somewhere better, even though every better place becomes temporary. He tells them to have faith, and that phrase becomes the emotional leash of the entire story. Faith, for Dutch, is not only belief in the future, it is belief in him. When Dutch says have faith, he is often asking people to stop asking questions. Psychologically, Dutch needs to be believed. That may be the most important thing about him. Some leaders need obedience, some need affection. Dutch needs belief, because his identity depends on being seen as visionary. He's not content to be a criminal boss who steals money and protects his crew. He has to be a thinker. He has to be a liberator. He has to be the man who sees through the lies of civilization. The gang is not merely his criminal organization, it is his proof that he is right about the world. This is why Dutch's speeches matter so much. He speaks in grand ideas. Freedom, loyalty, civilization, savagery, corruption, family, faith, betrayal. He rarely speaks in practical terms for long before turning the practical into the mythic. A robbery is not just a robbery, it is resistance against a corrupt order. Running from the law is not just survival, it is the last stand of free men. The gang's poverty is not just failure, it is temporary suffering on the way to paradise. Dutch is constantly transforming reality into a story where he remains the heroic centre. At the beginning, that storytelling has real power. The gang follows him because Dutch offers meaning. Many of these people are poor, traumatized, orphaned, hunted, rejected, or pushed outside respectable society. Dutch gives them a language that turns exclusion into dignity. They are not failures, they are free. They are not criminals, they are rebels. They are not desperate people living outside the law. They are a family refusing to bow to a rotten world. That is emotionally powerful, and it is not entirely false. Dutch really does save people. This is the part that makes him complicated. He takes in Arthur when Arthur is young and lost. He takes in John. He gives people like Tilly, Lenny, Javier, Charles and others a place to belong. He teaches reading, rhetoric, confidence and survival. He creates a community that feels warmer than the world around it. If Dutch were only a manipulator from the beginning, the tragedy would be smaller. The pain comes from the fact that the gang's love for him is built on real history. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch is not stupidity, it is attachment. Dutch raised him. Dutch gave him a world view. Dutch and Hosea shaped Arthur's identity from boyhood. Arthur is not merely an employee questioning a boss. He is a son slowly realizing his father may be dangerous. That makes every doubt harder. When Arthur begins to see cracks in Dutch's judgment, He's not only evaluating strategy, he's grieving the collapse of the person who taught him what loyalty meant. Dutch's relationship with Hosea is one of the best ways to understand his mind. Hosea is not just Dutch's friend. Hosea is his regulator. He is the counterweight, the old con man who can puncture Dutch's theatrical impulses with practicality and humour. Hosea knows Dutch's ego, but he also loves him. He can challenge Dutch in ways most gang members cannot. While Hosea lives, Dutch still has someone beside him who remembers the man under the performance. When Hosea dies, Dutch loses more than a strategist. He loses one of the last people capable of pulling him back from himself. The gang before the game begins seems to have functioned through a kind of unstable balance. Dutch provided vision, Hosea provided caution, Arthur provided force and loyalty. Together they could survive. But by 1899 that balance is already failing. Dutch's plans are becoming riskier. Hosea is tired. Arthur is aging into doubt. John is beginning to want a life outside the gang. The law is closing in. Civilization is no longer distant. The emotional structure that held the gang together is under more pressure than it can bear. To understand Dutch, it helps to imagine the man before the collapse, because the gang did not form around nothing. Dutch was not born on that mountain in Colter, already screaming about faith while everything burned. He had decades before that. He had charisma before desperation made it ugly. He had ideals before those ideals became excuses. Hosea met him when both men were younger, sharper, and probably still able to laugh at the world without sounding like they were trying to conquer it. Together they built something that was half criminal partnership and half wandering family. Dutch's early appeal came from the fact that he could make being outside society feel like a moral position rather than a failure. Many outlaws are simply outlaws because they have no other choice. But Dutch gave the life a philosophy. He read books. He quoted thinkers. He spoke as if robbing a bank could be part of a grand argument against industrial capitalism. To people who had been beaten down by poverty, racism, orphanhood, abuse, or bad luck, that mattered. Dutch did not merely say, "Come steal with me." He said, "The world that rejected you is rotten, and we are better than it." That is intoxicating. A person who has been discarded by society may already feel ashamed. Dutch takes that shame and turns it into pride. He tells them they are not the problem. Civilization is. He tells them the respectable world is built on hypocrisy, and he is often right. Banks do exploit. Industrialists do crush workers. Lawmen do protect property more fiercely than people. Government agents do lie. Dutch's critique has enough truth in it to become believable, and that is exactly why it is dangerous when he starts using it to excuse himself. A lie that contains no truth is easy to reject. Dutch's worldview is harder because it is built from real observations. The Gilded Age is brutal. The frontier is closing. Men like Cornwall do represent a new form of power, colder and more systematic than an outlaw gang. The Pinkertons really are violent agents of capital and state authority. Dutch sees the ugliness of the world clearly enough to sound like a prophet, but he cannot see his own ugliness with the same clarity, and that is the fatal imbalance. Dutch's reading is important because it gives him language, and language is how he controls emotional reality. He is not the strongest man in the gang. Arthur is stronger. He is not the most practical. Hosea is wiser. He is not the most ruthless. Micah may be worse, but Dutch has the best words. He can turn fear into courage for a night. He can turn loss into sacrifice. He can turn doubt into shame. He can turn a bad plan into a test of loyalty. A gang living under pressure will often follow the person who can make chaos feel meaningful. This does not mean Dutch is consciously faking everything. That is too simple. Dutch often seems to believe himself while he speaks. That is part of the danger. He is not merely manipulating others from a cold distance. He is also manipulating himself. His speeches are self-hypnosis. He talks until he can live inside the sentence. If he says they are close to freedom, he can feel close to freedom. If he says Arthur is doubting him, he can avoid feeling that Arthur may be right. If he says Micah is loyal, he can avoid admitting he prefers flattery to truth. There is a deep theatricality to Dutch. He does not simply enter rooms, he performs himself into them. The coat, the hair, the posture, the way he stands in camp, the way he addresses people, the way he raises his voice. Even when the gang is starving, Dutch behaves like a man who must remain visually and verbally larger than everyone else. This is not vanity in the simple sense of liking nice clothes, it is identity maintenance. Dutch has to look like the leader because if the image cracks, the faith cracks with it. The gang's campfire culture helps Dutch because it creates intimacy. People sing, eat, argue, play cards, share stories and rely on each other. Dutch sits at the centre of that emotional web. The gang does not feel like a military unit. It feels like a family, and family loyalty is harder to question than professional loyalty. If a boss makes a bad decision, you can leave. If a father makes a bad decision, leaving feels like betrayal. Dutch benefits from that blurred line. Dutch's fatherly role is especially powerful with Arthur and John. He takes in boys who need structure and belonging. He teaches them to read, to shoot, to survive, to think of themselves as more than discarded children. But he also teaches them to locate their moral compass in him. That is the hidden cost. Arthur learns loyalty, but he also learns to distrust his own doubts when they conflict with Dutch. John learns family, but also learns that leaving Dutch's orbit can feel like treason. The gang's ideals are constantly spoken as if they are shared equally, but Dutch owns the interpretation. Freedom means what Dutch says it means. Loyalty means loyalty to the version of the family Dutch controls. Betrayal means challenging Dutch at the wrong time. This is how charismatic groups can drift without noticing. The words stay the same while the meanings shift. Everyone still says family, faith, freedom. But slowly, those words begin serving the leader more than the people. Blackwater is the first wound we never fully see. That is important. Red Dead Redemption. 2 begins after the trauma, not during it. The gang is already reacting to something terrible. Dutch killed a woman named Heidi McCourt during the ferry robbery, and even the people loyal to him seem disturbed by it. The game does not show the killing directly, which makes it feel like a hole in the story. The gang keeps circling it, and Dutch keeps trying to outrun what it might mean. That killing matters psychologically because it suggests Dutch crossed a line before the player arrived. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he was always capable of it. Maybe Micah pushed the situation. Maybe the pressure revealed something that had been there for years. Whatever happened, the gang's memory of Blackwater becomes the first sign that Dutch's self-image and Dutch's behaviour are separating. He still speaks like a man of principle, but something in him has already acted outside the principles he claims to live by. Dutch's ego cannot easily tolerate that contradiction. A healthy person might say, "I did something terrible. I lost control. I need to face that." Dutch instead folds every failure into a larger narrative where he is still righteous. If the plan failed, it is because someone lacked faith. If the law found them, it is because civilization is closing in. If people died, it is because the world forced his hand. This is not just lying to others, it is self-protection. Dutch cannot survive psychologically as merely a frightened criminal who made a catastrophic mistake. He has to remain a visionary betrayed by circumstances. This is where narcissistic traits become visible. Dutch does not need to be diagnosed like a modern patient in a clinic. He is a fictional character in a violent historical world. But he clearly shows patterns associated with narcissistic psychology: grandiosity, need for admiration, sensitivity to criticism, a tendency to reinterpret failure as persecution, and difficulty seeing other people's needs when those needs challenge his self-image. Dutch loves the gang, but he also needs the gang to reflect his greatness back to him. His generosity often comes with ownership. Dutch gives people belonging, but that belonging has an emotional price. You must believe in him. You must stay loyal. We must accept his interpretation of events. If you question too much, you're not simply worried or thoughtful, you are losing faith. That is a very dangerous leadership style because it turns practical disagreement into moral betrayal. The group cannot correct the leader without becoming enemies of the leader's identity. Arthur's doubts threaten Dutch because Arthur is not a minor follower. Arthur is the gang's backbone. When Arthur questions him, Dutch cannot dismiss it as easily as he might dismiss Uncle's laziness or John's restlessness. Arthur knows him too well. Arthur has been there too long. Arthur's disappointment carries the weight of family. That is why Dutch reacts so sharply when Arthur hesitates. He hears not only disagreement, but abandonment. John threatens Dutch in another way. John's desire to protect Abigail and Jack points toward a future outside Dutch's myth. If John can leave, if John can become a husband and father more than an outlaw, then Dutch's entire ideology is challenged. Dutch says the gang is family, but John choosing his actual family reveals the tension inside that claim. Dutch wants the gang to be everyone's highest loyalty. Abigail and Jack make that impossible. Dutch often speaks as if civilization is the enemy, but he is also addicted to the romance of opposing it. He needs the enemy. The law, banks, industrialists, Pinkertons, Cornwall, the government, modernity itself. These forces are real and often brutal, but Dutch also uses them as psychological fuel. As long as civilization is monstrous, Dutch can remain heroic. The more cornered he becomes, the more he needs the enemy to be absolute, because absolute enemies justify absolute behaviour. This is why Leviticus Cornwall is such a useful opponent for Dutch's mind. Cornwall is rich, ruthless, industrial, and deeply tied to the systems Dutch hates. Robbing Cornwall feels ideological, not just profitable, but it is also strategically disastrous. Dutch keeps attacking power in ways that make power focus harder on the gang. He frames this as resistance, but increasingly it looks like ego. He cannot stand being small in a world controlled by men like Cornwall, so he strikes at them even when survival demands quiet. Dutch's repeated need for one more score is not only greed, it is avoidance. The phrase "one more score" suggests a future where everything will finally make sense. After this, they will leave. After this, they will be safe. After this, the sacrifices will be justified. That future never arrives because it is not a real plan. It is a psychological horizon. It lets Dutch postpone accountability. If salvation is always one more robbery away, then today's suffering can always be explained as temporary. Tahiti functions the same way. Tahiti is not really a plan. It is a fantasy object. Mangoes, warm weather, freedom, no law, no civilization. Dutch uses Tahiti as a dream the gang can project hope onto, but the details are absurdly thin. How will they get there? How much money is enough? What will they do? Who will survive the journey? Dutch does not need those questions answered, because Tahiti's purpose is emotional, not logistical. It keeps people moving. The tragedy is that many gang members want to believe. They are tired. They are scared. They have already sacrificed so much that disbelief would make the sacrifices feel meaningless. This is how destructive groups often maintain loyalty. The more people lose, the harder it becomes to admit the leader may be wrong, because admitting that means the losses may not have been leading anywhere. Dutch benefits from this sunk emotional cost, whether consciously or not. Micah Bell enters this fragile system like poison designed for exactly Dutch's weaknesses. Micah flatters Dutch's ego. He encourages aggression. He frames caution as weakness. He treats loyalty as obedience to Dutch personally, not care for the gang as a whole. Micah understands that Dutch wants to feel decisive, masculine, feared and visionary, so Micah gives him that reflection. Where Hosea challenges Dutch, Micah validates the worst version of him. Micah does not create Dutch's flaws from nothing. That would be too easy. Micah amplifies what is already there. Dutch already has pride. Micah feeds it. Dutch already fears betrayal. Micah points at Arthur and John. Dutch already wants dramatic action. Micah calls it strength. Dutch already needs someone to blame. Micah supplies targets. This is why Micah is so dangerous psychologically. He is not persuasive because he is smarter than everyone. He is persuasive because he tells Dutch the story Dutch increasingly wants to hear. Hosea's death removes the counterweight at the exact moment Micah's influence becomes strongest. The St. Denis bank robbery is a catastrophe. Hosea is captured and executed in front of the gang. Lenny is killed during the escape. The plan fails publicly and brutally. Dutch loses his oldest friend, one of his brightest young men, and the illusion that the gang can still outmaneuver the modern world through cleverness. After St. Denis, Dutch is not simply grieving, he is psychologically exposed. Grief does not make Dutch kinder, it makes him more defensive. This is important. Some people become softer when loss breaks them open. Dutch becomes harder because grief threatens the story he needs to believe. If Hosea died because Dutch's plan was reckless, then Dutch must face guilt. If Lenny died because Dutch misjudged the situation, then Dutch must face responsibility. Instead, Dutch moves toward more blame, more certainty, more speeches, more desperate action. Guama is a major psychological breaking point. The gang is ripped away from the map, from their routines, from the remaining structure of their identity. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill and Micah are stranded in a violent colonial conflict. Dutch sees oppression there, and he is not wrong. The island is brutal, Fusar is monstrous. But Dutch's response reveals how unstable he has become. He kills Gloria, an old woman who helps guide them, because he decides she cannot be trusted and because she asks for more money. Arthur sees it. Arthur is horrified. The killing of Gloria is one of the clearest signs that Dutch's moral boundaries have eroded. Unlike a gunfight, this is intimate and ugly. He strangles an elderly woman in a cave, then tries to explain it away. Arthur's reaction matters because Arthur has seen Dutch kill before, but this feels different. It feels small, paranoid, unnecessary. It resembles Blackwater in miniature. Dutch crossing a line and immediately needing the world to accept his justification. After Guama, Dutch's paranoia becomes more visible. He begins seeing betrayal everywhere. He suspects John. He doubts Arthur. He listens to Micah. The gang has been infiltrated by informants and hunted by Pinkertons, so paranoia is not entirely irrational. But Dutch's paranoia becomes selective in a revealing way. He distrusts the people who challenge him and trusts the person who flatters him. That is not healthy caution. That is ego-protective suspicion. Molly O'Shea's death shows how badly the gang's emotional world has deteriorated. Molly claims she talked to the Pinkertons, but later Milton reveals she did not. She says it because she is hurt, drunk, desperate, and starved for Dutch's attention. Dutch has emotionally abandoned her, and her false confession becomes a suicidal act of protest. Susan Grimshaw kills her according to the gang's code. Dutch does not save her. The man who speaks endlessly about family has created a family where a lonely woman can die for trying to be seen. Dutch's relationship with Molly reveals another part of him. He loves admiration more than intimacy. Molly wants to be loved as a partner, not as another believer in his legend. Dutch does not know what to do with that kind of need once it stops flattering him. He becomes distant, irritated, dismissive. Molly's pain is not strategically important to him, so he fails to treat it as real until it explodes in front of everyone. Arthur's tuberculosis changes the psychological balance too. As Arthur becomes physically weaker, he becomes morally clearer. The disease strips away his illusions. He starts seeing the gang, Dutch, and himself without the old romance. Dutch, meanwhile, becomes more grandiose and defensive. The son is moving toward truth as the father moves toward delusion. That contrast gives the final chapters their emotional power. Arthur's illness also threatens Dutch because it changes Arthur's priorities. Arthur begins caring less about money and more about saving who can still be saved. He wants John, Abigail and Jack to escape. He wants the younger and more vulnerable gang members to survive. Dutch wants one more plan. Arthur wants an exit from Dutch's plans. That makes Arthur dangerous to Dutch's control. Dutch's abandonment of John during the train robbery is one of the moments where his collapse becomes undeniable. John is left behind, and Dutch seems far too willing to let him remain gone. Later, Dutch refuses to rescue Abigail when she's taken, even though the old Dutch would have thundered about loyalty and family. Arthur hears the contradiction. Sadie hears it too. By then, Dutch's definition of family has shrunk to those who still reinforce Dutch. This shrinking circle is common in authoritarian emotional systems. At first, the leader claims to act for everyone. As pressure rises, the real group becomes smaller. The loyal, the obedient, the useful, the flattering. Doubters become traitors. People with independent needs become burdens. Dutch does not say, "I only care about myself." He still speaks in the language of family and faith, but his behaviour reveals the truth. The family now exists to preserve Dutch's story. The O'Driscoll feud reveals Dutch's emotional history with violence. Colm O'Driscoll is not just another rival. He's a mirror from the old outlaw world, another gang leader with blood on his hands and followers to spend. Dutch hates Colm, but their feud also keeps Dutch locked in the past. Annabelle, the woman Colm killed, haunts Dutch's memory. Dutch killed Colm's brother in return. The feud is personal, cyclical, and almost ritualistic. It shows that Dutch has been living inside revenge long before the game begins. When Dutch captures Colm later, or when Colm captures Arthur, the feud feels less like strategy and more like old poison. Colm sees through Dutch in some ways because he is part of the same dying ecosystem. They both use men, they both speak of loyalty, they both survive through violence. Dutch tells himself he is better, and perhaps he is in some ways, but the feud makes the difference feel less clean than Dutch would like. The Cornwall train robbery early in the game is a perfect example of Dutch choosing symbolic defiance over low-profile survival. The gang is in trouble after Blackwater. They need to disappear. Robbing a powerful industrialist train does the opposite, but Dutch cannot resist the target because Cornwall represents everything he hates. That robbery brings heat, but it also gives Dutch emotional satisfaction. He is struck at the machine. The problem is that the machine remembers. Strauss's money lending is another contradiction inside Dutch's family. Dutch speaks against the cruelty of banks and debt, yet Strauss operates a predatory lending business within the gang's economy. Arthur collects from desperate people, including Thomas Downs, which eventually leads to his tuberculosis. Dutch tolerates this because the gang needs money. The hypocrisy is glaring. They condemn exploitation while practicing their own smaller version of it. Arthur eventually sees this and throws Strauss out. Dutch never truly reckons with it. The Downs debt is one of the most important moral events in the game, even though Dutch is not directly present for the collection. Dutch's system creates the conditions. The gang needs money. Strauss lends. Arthur enforces. A sick poor man is beaten for debt. Later, Arthur dies from the disease he contracts there. The entire romantic outlaw myth collapses into one ugly truth. The gang also hurts poor people. Not only banks, not only Cornwall, poor people. Dutch's ideology struggles with that truth because it complicates his clean division between the free gang and corrupt civilization. If the gang exploits the vulnerable too, then their moral superiority weakens. Arthur's late-game kindness toward Edith Downs and her son becomes part of his redemption because he recognises this. Dutch does not. Dutch remains too invested in the larger myth to look closely at the small victims. The Roads chapter shows Dutch and Hosea trying to play aristocratic decay against itself. The Greys and Braithwaites are old southern families rotting under pride, racism and greed. Dutch thinks the gang can exploit that rot and walk away richer. But the families are not as foolish as Dutch wants them to be, and the gang underestimates how quickly manipulation can become vulnerability. Sean dies, Jack is kidnapped, the con becomes personal. Sean's death is another destabilizing moment because it is sudden, public, and humiliating. 1 second he is talking. The next, he is gone. There is no heroic last stand, no speech, no meaning, just a bullet from an ambush. These sudden deaths chip away at Dutch's ability to keep the story romantic. The gang can sing around fires, but the world can still erase one of them mid-sentence. Dutch's response to Jack's kidnapping is emotionally effective because it aligns the gang behind a righteous cause. The assault on Braithwaite Manor is one of the moments where the gang looks most unified. Dutch, Arthur, John, Hosea, Javier, Bill and the others move together like a family with one purpose. For a moment, Dutch's leadership feels true again. The audience can understand why people follow him. He can give fear a direction. But after Jack has recovered from Bronte, Dutch cannot let the humiliation go. Bronte did return the child, but he also treated Dutch as a lesser criminal, a rustic fool. Dutch's later revenge is fueled by that insult. He tells himself Bronte is a monster, and Bronte is certainly dangerous, but the excessive nature of the killing reveals the personal wound beneath the moral language. Dutch is avenging his pride as much as protecting the gang. The trolley station job is another example of Dutch being baited by the illusion of opportunity. Bronte feeds them bad information, and Dutch follows it into disaster. A more cautious leader might treat the gift with suspicion. Dutch wants to believe he can still turn St. Denis into a playground for outlaw cleverness. The crash that follows is almost symbolic, Dutch's old confidence colliding with the modern city at full speed. The bank robbery after that feels like Dutch trying to recover control through scale. If the trolley job failed, go bigger. If Bronte humiliated them, hit the bank. If the city feels unbeatable, prove it can be beaten. But this escalation is exactly what destroys them. Hosea's death outside the bank is the image of Dutch's old life being executed by the new order. Lenny's death during the escape is the future being cut down behind him. After Guama, the killing of Cornwall is another revealing scene. Dutch confronts Cornwall directly in Ansburg, and the conversation quickly becomes fatal. Strategically, killing Cornwall does not save the gang, it increases pressure. Psychologically, it allows Dutch to feel like he has struck the great enemy in the face. He can kill the man, but he cannot kill what Cornwall represents. Industry, capital, law and modern power do not die with one body. Dutch's tragedy is partly that he keeps personalizing systems too large to shoot. The Wapiti storyline also reveals Dutch's willingness to use suffering when it serves him. Rains Fall wants peace and restraint. Eagle Flies wants resistance against the government's exploitation. Dutch sees opportunity. He encourages conflict because it can distract the army and help his gang. He speaks the language of anti-government solidarity, and again there is truth in his criticism. The government is stealing from the Wapiti. But Dutch's support is contaminated by self-interest. He is willing to inflame another people's tragedy to cover his own escape. Arthur recognizes this, and his relationship with Rainsfall becomes a contrast to Dutch's exploitation. Rainsfall offers Arthur a vision of grief handled with dignity, restraint, and sorrow. Dutch offers rage disguised as liberation. Arthur, dying and morally awakening, is drawn to Rainsfall's sadness because it asks for responsibility rather than spectacle. Dutch cannot accept that kind of restraint because restraint does not make him feel powerful. Eaglefly's death is another consequence Dutch avoids feeling fully. The young man is brave, angry and manipulated by the conditions around him. Dutch does not create the government's oppression, but he uses the conflict for his own ends. When Eagleflies dies, saving Arthur, the cost becomes personal. Dutch's grand war against civilization has helped consume another young life that was not his to spend. The train job near the end is framed as one last chance, but by then the phrase has lost all credibility. The gang has heard it too many times. One more job, one more score, one more plan. Dutch keeps promising arrival, but the pattern itself has become the destination. The gang is no longer moving toward freedom. They are orbiting Dutch's inability to stop. Abigail's capture by Milton reveals the final moral split. Dutch does not want to rescue her. Arthur and Sadie do. In the old family myth, leaving Abigail would have been unthinkable. By this point, Dutch's priorities are exposed. Abigail is not central to his plan, and John is suspect, so her life becomes negotiable. Arthur's decision to rescue her is a rejection of Dutch's hierarchy. He chooses actual loyalty over declared loyalty. Milton's revelation that Micah has been informing since Guama confirms Arthur's suspicion, but comes too late to save the gang. It is psychologically perfect that Dutch struggles to accept this truth, even when it explains everything. Accepting Micah's betrayal means admitting Arthur was right. Hosea would have been right, and Dutch's judgment failed catastrophically. For Dutch, truth is not only information, it is humiliation, so he resists it until reality corners him. Arthur's final confrontation with Dutch is devastating because Arthur does not ask for much. He does not ask Dutch to fix everything. He does not ask him to become perfect. He asks him to see Micah, to see the betrayal, to see Arthur. Dutch cannot. Or he can, but only too late, and not enough. His silence on that mountain is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the game. Dutch has no speech left that can hold the contradictions together. When Dutch walks away from Arthur, he is walking away from the person who most clearly represents his failed fatherhood. Arthur gave Dutch loyalty for decades. Arthur killed for him, stole for him, believed in him, defended him, doubted himself for him. At the end, Arthur is dying and telling the truth. Dutch cannot meet that truth, so he leaves. It is cowardice, but not simple cowardice. It is the collapse of a man who cannot survive the reflection Arthur offers him. In the high honour ending, Arthur dies facing the sunrise. That image is often discussed as Arthur's redemption, but it is also Dutch's indictment. Arthur, the outlaw Dutch raised, finds moral clarity at the end. Dutch, the man who preached ideals, walks into darkness. The son becomes what the father pretended to be, someone willing to sacrifice himself so others can live free. By the epilogue, Dutch is a ghost of himself. When John finds him with Micah on Mount Hagen, Dutch seems hollow, almost detached from the grand performance he once lived inside. He shoots Micah, but even that action is ambiguous. Is it revenge? Shame? A final rejection of the man who exposed what Dutch became? Maybe all of it. Dutch does not explain himself because explanations are no longer enough. He simply walks away, leaving the money behind. Leaving the money is important. For years, Dutch said money was the answer. Money for escape. Money for Tahiti. Money for freedom. At Mount Hagen, the money is sitting there, and Dutch abandons it. This suggests that money was never truly the point, not by itself. The point was the dream, the control, the story of being on the verge of deliverance. Once the gang is gone and the dream is dead, the money loses its magic. Looking at Dutch through Red Dead Redemption, one changes the feeling of Red Dead Redemption 2. In the first game, Dutch is already the ruined version. He's older, harsher, and more openly nihilistic. He still speaks with intelligence, but the warmth of the gang father is mostly gone. John is hunting him not as a confused son still inside the family, but as a former follower facing the ghost of the man who shaped him. Red Dead Redemption 2 makes that future hurt more because it shows what Dutch once was, or at least what people once believed he was. The Dutch of 1911 still hates the government, still hates civilization, and still sees himself outside ordinary law. But his rebellion has become thinner. He leads native men and outcasts in ways that echo his old pattern, but there is less pretense of building a loving family. He still uses the rhetoric of resistance, yet the bitterness is more exposed. The dream has lost its softness. What remains is grievance, violence, and the need to keep standing against a world that has already moved on. John's conversations with Dutch in 1911 are full of exhausted recognition. John knows Dutch's language. He knows the rhythm of the speeches. He knows how Dutch turns defeat into philosophy. But John is no longer a boy trying to earn Dutch's approval. He has become a father trying to protect his own family from the consequences of the old life. This reversal is crucial. John once threatened Dutch by wanting to leave. In Red Dead Redemption 1, John's attempt to live outside Dutch's myth becomes the whole reason he must confront him. Dutch's final moments in Red Dead Redemption 1 are strangely lucid. He tells John that their time has passed. He recognises, at least briefly, that men like them are being erased by the modern world. But his clarity does not lead to humility or repair. It leads to death. Dutch cannot imagine becoming ordinary. He cannot imagine surrendering to a world where he is not a symbol. His final act is to step off the cliff rather than be captured and reduced. That suicide is consistent with his psychology. Dutch can tolerate danger, but not diminishment. Capture would mean being processed by the state, displayed as a criminal, stripped of the last scraps of myth. By choosing death, Dutch controls the final image. Even in defeat, he refuses to let the system put him in a cage. There is a tragic dignity there, but also the same old ego. Dutch would rather become a legend falling than a man answering questions. His death also leaves John with no real closure. John does what the government demands, but it does not save him. The system Dutch warned about still consumes John. This is part of the larger Red Dead tragedy. Dutch is wrong in how he lives, but not completely wrong about the world. The government really is ruthless. Civilization really does devour outlaws and then discard the tools it used to catch them. Dutch's critique survives him, even though Dutch himself is corrupted by it. This is why the Red Dead series refuses easy moral comfort. Dutch is dangerous, manipulative, and responsible for enormous suffering. But the forces opposing him are not pure justice. The Pinkertons, the Bureau, industrial capital, expansionist government power, and the machinery of modern law are also violent. Arthur and John are trapped between a false father and a cold state. Dutch's failure does not make civilization innocent. Civilization's brutality does not make Dutch righteous. Dutch's tragedy, then, is that he sees enough truth to become persuasive, but not enough truth to become wise. He sees the cruelty of the system. He sees the hypocrisy of rich men. He sees that law often serves money. He sees that freedom is being fenced, bought, and policed. But he cannot see that his own camp has become another little kingdom of control. He can diagnose the disease outside him, while spreading another disease inside the people who trust him. Arthur's redemption exposes Dutch more than any Pinkerton ever could. The law can call Dutch a criminal, but Dutch already rejects the law's moral authority. Arthur's judgment matters because it comes from inside the family. Arthur has lived Dutch's ideals, committed Dutch's crimes, and believed Dutch's words. When Arthur chooses to help John escape, he does not side with civilization. He sides with the human meaning Dutch claimed to believe in. That is why Arthur's final actions are so damning. Arthur becomes free when he stops needing Dutch's approval. This is a quiet psychological liberation. For most of his life, Arthur's self-worth is tied to usefulness within the gang. He is the enforcer, the provider, the loyal son. Tuberculosis destroys the future he thought he had, but it also frees him from the endless bargain of earning Dutch's praise. With death approaching, Arthur can ask a simpler question. Who can I still help? Dutch cannot answer that question because helping others has become secondary to preserving the dream. John's escape is Arthur's answer to Dutch's failure. Dutch talked about freedom for decades. Arthur creates one small piece of it by getting John back to his family. It is not grand. It does not overthrow the government. It does not save the gang. It does not undo the past. But it is real. That difference matters. Dutch increasingly offers imaginary salvation. Arthur offers practical sacrifice. In the moral universe of Red Dead Redemption 2, practical sacrifice is worth more than beautiful speeches. Micah's survival until Mount Hagen shows the lingering infection of Dutch's final choices. Micah represents the version of the outlaw life stripped of romance, greed, cruelty, betrayal, domination. Dutch choosing Micah over Arthur is the symbolic death of the gang's ideals. Years later, Dutch shooting Micah may be the closest he comes to admitting that choice was wrong, but he does it too late. After Arthur is dead, the gang is gone, and John's future is already shadowed. Dutch's silence after shooting Micah is more powerful than another speech would have been. For once words fail him. He cannot explain himself without exposing too much. If he says he came for revenge, why so late? If he says he did not know, how can he face what Arthur told him? If he says he is sorry, who is left to receive it? So he leaves. Dutch's final gift to John is not wisdom, apology, or blessing. It is an opening, and even that opening is stained by years of damage. The money left behind at Mount Hagen becomes almost absurd. The gang chased money through snow, mud, blood, cities, islands, and caves. People died for it. Dutch preached that money would buy escape. Yet when the chest is finally there, Dutch does not take it. This reveals the emptiness at the centre of the chase. Money was always a symbol for a future Dutch could describe but not build. When the people who made the dream feel alive are gone, the symbol becomes dead weight. The question of whether Dutch was always like this is one of the most important questions in the story, because people rarely become someone entirely new under pressure. More often, pressure reveals, exaggerates, and reorganises what was already there. Dutch likely always had a need to be admired. He likely always enjoyed the sound of his own ideas. He likely always preferred dramatic action to quiet compromise. But earlier in life, those traits were balanced by success, friendship, Hosea's influence, and the genuine warmth of the gang. Under the right conditions, his flaws could look like strengths. Charisma, for example, can be a gift. Dutch's charisma helps him comfort frightened people, recruit the rejected, and stand against powerful enemies. But charisma without humility becomes manipulation. Vision can be a gift too. Dutch sees beyond the immediate ugliness of poverty and law. He imagines a different life, but vision without accountability becomes delusion. Courage can be a gift. Dutch is not physically cowardly in the ordinary sense. He will face danger. But courage without prudence becomes recklessness. Dutch's tragedy is that many of his worst traits are his best traits deprived of restraint. This is why Hosea matters so much. Hosea is restraint. He does not remove Dutch's charisma, he grounds it. He does not kill the dream, he asks how they will survive it. He does not deny the corruption of civilization, he remembers that the gang is made of vulnerable people who can die if Dutch miscalculates. When Hosea dies, Dutch does not become a different species of man. He becomes Dutch without enough restraint, Dutch without the friend who could make him laugh at himself, Dutch without the person who could challenge him from inside the old bond. Arthur also becomes restraint, but too late, and from the wrong position in Dutch's emotional hierarchy. Arthur is the son, the enforcer, the man Dutch expects to rely on. When Arthur becomes the conscience, Dutch experiences it as reversal. A father can sometimes hear a brother's criticism more easily than a son's. Hosea could say, "Slow down," and Dutch might grumble but listen. Arthur says, "This is wrong," and Dutch hears mutiny. This is one of the cruel dynamics of the final chapters. Arthur becomes what Dutch needs, but Dutch cannot accept it from him. There is also the question of Dutch's relationship with class. Dutch hates the rich, but he also enjoys refinement. He dresses well, he reads, he likes elegant language. He does not want to be a crude bandit. He wants to be above both the poor criminal and the rich capitalist, a free gentleman outlaw with moral superiority over everyone. This creates a class fantasy of its own. Dutch despises elites, but he also wants to feel elite in spirit. He rejects society's hierarchy while building a romantic hierarchy where he sits at the top. His hatred of money is equally complicated. Dutch condemns greed, yet everything becomes about getting enough money. This is not simply hypocrisy. Money represents escape from dependence, and dependence is what Dutch hates. If they have enough money, no one can control them. No bank, no law, no employer, no landlord, no government. But because the amount is never defined, money becomes a symbolic cure for every anxiety. The undefined cure can never fail, because it is never actually reached. Dutch's dream of the West is also nostalgic even while he is living inside its death. He imagines freedom as space, open land, movement, no fences, no schedules, no bosses. But the story takes place when that world is closing. The railroad, telegraph, banks, police systems, federal authority and industrial capital are making space legible and controllable. Dutch is not only fighting people, he is fighting mapping, paperwork, property and time. The tragedy is that you cannot shoot a filing system and call it victory. This makes Dutch's outlaw identity almost religious. The outlaw is not just someone outside the law. For Dutch, the outlaw is a last sacred figure of freedom. The problem is that sacred identities cannot adapt easily. If Dutch becomes a rancher, worker, farmer or quiet exile, does he remain Dutch? If he accepts a smaller life, was the grand life a mistake? Dutch's ego cannot survive those questions, so he keeps choosing the outlaw performance even when it destroys the people who trusted it. Arthur, by contrast, becomes capable of accepting smallness. Late in the game, Arthur's good deeds are not grand revolutionary acts. He helps Mrs. Downs, he helps John escape, he comforts people where he can, he admits fear, he accepts death. This humility is what Dutch lacks. Dutch wants freedom as a grand destination. Arthur discovers redemption as small concrete acts performed with no guarantee of reward. That difference is why Arthur's ending can feel peaceful even though it is tragic. Dutch's decline also shows the danger of confusing loyalty with identity. For many gang members, being loyal to Dutch becomes part of who they are. Javier, Bill and Arthur have all built selves inside the gang. When Dutch becomes dangerous, leaving him is not only a tactical choice, it is identity loss. Who is Javier without Dutch's cause? Who is Bill without Dutch's approval? Who is Arthur without the family that raised him? Dutch's power comes partly from the fact that people do not know who they would be outside his story. This is why Arthur's transformation is so profound. He starts imagining an identity beyond Dutch before he dies. Not a long future, because he has no long future left, but a moral identity. He can be a man who helps, a man who tells the truth, a man who gives John a chance. Arthur cannot leave and build a new life, but he can die as someone other than Dutch's instrument. That is his freedom. Dutch, ironically, cannot imagine that kind of inner freedom. He speaks of freedom constantly, but his own self is trapped in performance. He must be leader, visionary, rebel, father, martyr, philosopher. He cannot simply be wrong, scared, grieving, or tired. The roles are too heavy. By the end, Dutch is less free than almost anyone in the gang because he is imprisoned by the image he created. The repeated phrase, "have faith," becomes darker when seen this way. Faith is beautiful when it means trust through uncertainty. But Dutch uses faith to suspend evaluation. Faith becomes a demand that others ignore evidence for the sake of emotional unity. In healthy relationships, faith and honesty coexist. In Dutch's gang, faith increasingly replaces honesty. That's why Arthur's honesty feels like betrayal. He is breaking the spell. Dutch's speeches also create emotional debt. When someone saves you, teaches you, and gives you a home, disagreeing with them can feel ungrateful. Dutch may not consciously calculate this every time, but he benefits from it. Arthur owes Dutch, John owes Dutch, many gang members owe Dutch. The debts are emotional, not financial, but they function like chains. This is another irony. Dutch hates debt as a tool of civilization, but his family runs on debts of gratitude. Micah has almost no such debt. That is part of why he is dangerous. He is not bound by the old emotional history. He can manipulate Dutch without mourning the gang's ideals because he never truly believed in them. Arthur is slowed by love. Hosea is slowed by history. John is slowed by family. Micah is not slowed. He moves through the gang like a parasite that understands the host better than the host understands itself. Dutch's choice to trust Micah may also come from exhaustion with being morally challenged. Hosea challenges him. Arthur challenges him. Abigail challenges him. John's existence challenges him. Rain's fall challenges him by example. Micah does not challenge. Micah simplifies. After enough stress, simplification feels like relief. Dutch no longer has to wrestle with whether he is wrong. Micah tells him the problem is weakness and betrayal. For a collapsing ego, that answer is comforting. This is where Dutch's intelligence works against him. A less articulate man might have fewer ways to rationalize. Dutch can build arguments quickly. He can connect personal desires to political ideals. He can make selfish action sound historically necessary. He can turn emotional reactions into philosophy. Intelligence in service of self-defense becomes dangerous because it makes denial elegant. His relationship with the word civilization is also worth slowing down. In Dutch's mouth, civilization means corruption, control, greed, hypocrisy, and spiritual death. But civilization also means medicine, stability, schools, homes, and the possibility that Jack might grow up without learning to rob trains. Dutch collapses civilization into its worst features because that helps him reject it entirely. Abigail, John, and Arthur eventually see that the alternative to Dutch's life is not necessarily surrender. Sometimes it is survival. The game's world supports this ambiguity. The modern world is not kind. John's attempt at ranch life eventually fails under government coercion. Arthur's hope for John is not a guaranteed happy ending. But the fact that civilization is cruel does not mean Dutch's gang is safe. Red Dead Redemption 2 lives in that tragic middle. There may be no pure place to run. That is why Dutch's promise of a pure elsewhere is so seductive and so false. Tahiti is pure elsewhere. It is warm, distant, vague, and almost untouched by practical detail. In psychological terms, it is a dissociative fantasy for the group. Everyone can imagine what they need inside it. Dutch imagines freedom and vindication. Some gang members imagine rest, others imagine safety. But because the fantasy is vague, it cannot be planned toward honestly. It is not a destination with logistics, it is a sedative. Australia, New York, the West, the mountains, the next camp, the next score, the next chance. Dutch's promised futures shift because the psychological need remains the same. Keep hope ahead of the present. Keep the group moving. Keep the reckoning delayed. A stable plan would require measurable progress. Dutch avoids measurable progress because measurement would expose failure. This is why the ledger and camp funds feel almost darkly comic beside Dutch's speeches. The game lets the player donate money, buy upgrades, improve camp supplies, and see practical needs. Meanwhile, Dutch speaks of huge escapes. The player may have hundreds or thousands of dollars, yet the story insists the gang still needs more. This disconnect mirrors Dutch's psychology. Enough is not a number. Enough is the feeling of safety and vindication Dutch can never reach. Dutch's moral collapse can also be read through his treatment of the vulnerable. Early Dutch protects vulnerable people, or at least claims to. Late Dutch sacrifices or abandons them when they interfere with the plan. Molly is emotionally discarded. Abigail is nearly abandoned. John is left. Eagle Flies is used. Arthur's illness is minimized. The vulnerable become inconvenient because they demand present tense care, and Dutch lives increasingly in future tense justification. Present tense care is not dramatic. It is checking on someone, listening, changing plans, accepting limits, losing money to save a person, apologizing, admitting fear. Dutch can perform dramatic rescue when it enhances the myth, as with Jack at Braithwaite Manor. He struggles with ordinary care when it constrains him. That difference reveals the gap between heroic self-image and daily love. The final standoff in camp, with Arthur accusing Micah and Dutch unable to choose truth quickly, is the family system exposed. People line up not only according to evidence, but according to psychological dependence. Who needs Dutch's story to remain true? Who can survive without it? Who has already found another loyalty? The guns point across years of accumulated denial. It is not just a plot twist, it is a family splitting in real time. Javier's hesitation, Bill's alignment, Grimshaw's intervention, Micah's aggression, Arthur's exhaustion, Dutch's confusion. Every pose in that scene tells a story. Dutch has spent years making himself the centre, and now the centre cannot hold. The family does not know what to do because the father cannot tell the truth. Then violence interrupts, as it always does in Dutch's life, preventing the emotional reckoning from becoming a full conversation. Arthur crawling, fighting, coughing, and still trying to warn Dutch is one of the clearest images of abused loyalty turning into moral witness. Arthur is dying, but he's still trying to give Dutch one last chance to see. That is the tragedy of children of charismatic parents or leaders. Even when they know the truth, some part of them still wants the parent to understand, apologise, or choose them. Dutch does not. When Dutch leaves Arthur, he also leaves the last person who could have given his story a different ending. If Dutch had knelt, helped Arthur, rejected Micah, or even simply admitted failure, the moral shape of his life would shift. It would not erase the harm, but it would create a final truth. Instead, he walks away. That walking away is his psychological signature. When reality becomes unbearable, he exits rather than humbles himself. Mount Hagen years later is a delayed echo of that mountain. Dutch appears again at a height, again with Micah, again facing John, again surrounded by the consequences of the old gang. This time he shoots Micah. But the act is too late to be redemption. It is more like a confession without words. Dutch finally kills the parasite, but only after the host is dead. The gang cannot be restored. Arthur cannot hear it. Hosea cannot nod. The moral repair arrives after the family it might have saved is gone. The fact that Dutch walks away from the money and into the snow makes him feel almost spectral. He is no longer chasing Tahiti. He is no longer gathering the family. He is no longer even explaining. He is a man who has outlived his own myth and does not know what to replace it with. That emptiness leads toward Red Dead Redemption 1, where he becomes a final remnant of a dead age. The Dutch of Red Dead Redemption 1 is what remains years later. A man who has stripped his ideology down to bitterness and violence. He still speaks beautifully. He still criticizes civilization. He still frames himself as outside the system, but the warmth is almost gone. The father of the Van Der Linde gang has become the leader of another violent group, more openly hollow, more openly lost. John sees him as a man who used to be something else. That is part of the tragedy. Dutch did not fall in one moment. He decayed into the person he later became. Dutch's final line in Red Dead Redemption 1, about their time having passed, is one of the clearest truths he ever speaks. He understands, at least then, that the world he fought against has already won. But even that truth is wrapped in fatalism. Dutch cannot imagine a humble life inside the new world. If he cannot be free on his own mythic terms, he would rather die. His suicide is the final expression of his inability to live without the story that made him grand. So was Dutch always bad, or did he change? The most honest answer is both, and neither in a simple way. The seeds were always there. Ego, theatricality, need for admiration, hatred of constraint, ability to rationalize violence. But the love was real too. The ideals were not entirely fake. The community he built mattered. Pressure, failure, grief, aging, law, Micah. and the collapse of the frontier all pushed his worst traits forward until they consumed the better ones. Dutch's psychology is tragic because his virtues and flaws are intertwined. His charisma lets him rescue people, but also manipulate them. His imagination lets him dream of freedom, but also flee reality. His hatred of oppression lets him see real injustice, but also justify his own violence. His love of family creates belonging, but his need to be obeyed corrupts that belonging. Dutch is dangerous because the good parts of him make the bad parts easier to trust. That is why Arthur's disillusionment hurts so much. Arthur is not discovering that Dutch never meant anything. He's discovering that meaning can curdle. A man can believe in freedom and still become controlling. A man can love his family and still destroy it. A man can speak truth about a corrupt society and still use that truth to avoid responsibility. Dutch's tragedy is not that every word was false. It is that truth and self-deception became impossible to separate in him. Dutch's psychology can be understood through cognitive dissonance, the mental strain that appears when a person's beliefs and actions no longer match. Dutch believes he is a liberator, a protector, a father to the unwanted, but he robs, manipulates, kills, abandons, and escalates danger. The more his actions contradict his self-image, the more he needs explanations. He cannot simply say, "I am becoming what I hate." Instead, he says the world forced him, the gang doubted him, the plan was sound, the traitors ruined it, the next score will fix it. Cognitive dissonance becomes more severe when a person has sacrificed too much to turn back. Dutch has spent his entire adult life building an identity around being outside civilization. He cannot easily admit the life is failing because that would mean admitting decades of violence may not have led to freedom, so he doubles down. Every failure becomes evidence that they must push harder. Every cost becomes a reason to continue. This is how a dream becomes a trap. Leaving it would make the pain meaningless, so the dream demands more pain. Narcissistic injury is another useful lens. Dutch's grand self-image is constantly wounded by events he cannot control. Blackwater humiliates him. Cornwall challenges him. Bronte tricks him. The St. Denis Bank destroys his confidence. Hosea dies. Arthur questions him. John tries to leave. The Pinkertons predict his movements. Modernity itself makes him feel obsolete. Each injury threatens the fantasy of Dutch as master strategist and chosen leader. His anger often follows humiliation, not just danger. When Dutch is humiliated, he tends to seek dramatic restoration. Bronte embarrasses him, so Bronte dies in a degrading way. Cornwall pressures him, so Dutch confronts him directly. Arthur doubts him, so Dutch questions Arthur's loyalty. The psychological pattern is not simply strategic retaliation, it is ego repair. Dutch needs to feel powerful again after feeling small. The more the world shrinks him, the louder and riskier his actions become. Paranoia enters because Dutch's world really is full of threats. The Pinkertons are hunting them. The law is corrupt. There are informants. The gang is exposed. But paranoia becomes pathological when it stops evaluating evidence fairly and starts serving emotional needs. Dutch's suspicion lands most heavily on people who challenge him. Arthur becomes suspect because Arthur sees too clearly. John becomes suspect because John wants out. Meanwhile, Micah, the actual rat, becomes trusted because he protects Dutch's ego. This selective paranoia is one of Dutch's clearest failures. A truly careful leader would distrust Micah's cruelty, opportunism, and constant agitation. Hosea likely does. Arthur certainly does. But Dutch hears Micah's aggression as loyalty. Micah's flattery feels like evidence because Dutch wants it to be evidence. Paranoia and vanity work together. He distrusts truth that hurts and trusts lies that soothe. Dutch also shows a messiah complex, not in the sense of believing he is literally divine, but in the sense of believing he has a special mission to lead people out of corruption. He does not merely want to survive, he wants to redeem the gang from civilization, to guide them toward a freer life. to stand as the man who sees through the world's falsehood. This makes practical compromise difficult. A man on a mission cannot easily admit that the mission should end. The Messiah complex also explains why Dutch reacts so badly to doubt. If he were only a boss, doubt would be annoying. If he's a saviour, doubt becomes sin. This is why faith becomes such a loaded word. Dutch is not asking for confidence in a plan, he's asking for spiritual obedience to his role. When Arthur loses faith, Dutch experiences it almost like apostasy. Cult leader dynamics appear throughout the gang, though the Van Der Linde gang is not a cult in a simple modern sense. It has practical criminal functions, genuine affection, and real mutual dependence. But Dutch uses several cult-like mechanisms: charismatic authority, isolation from mainstream society, moral language that elevates the group above outsiders, suspicion of defectors, a promised future paradise, and the reframing of criticism as betrayal. These dynamics become stronger as external pressure increases. The promised paradise is crucial. Tahiti, Australia, the West, a ranch, somewhere warm, somewhere free. Dutch's destination changes shape because its details are less important than its emotional function. In destructive groups, the promised future often stays just out of reach. The leader explains that more sacrifice is needed, more loyalty, more money, more faith. The destination must remain distant because reaching it would test whether the promise was real. Dutch's control is emotional more than logistical. He does not lock people in camp. People can wander, argue, drink, sing, and even complain. But emotionally, the cost of leaving is enormous. Leaving means abandoning family, betraying the dream, admitting that life may be doomed, and facing a society that may not accept them. Dutch's genius is that he makes the gang feel like the only moral home available. Once that belief is in place, physical chains are unnecessary. The gang's language reinforces this. They are family. They are different. They are free. The outside world is corrupt, dead, enslaved, civilized in the worst sense. Again, there is truth here. The outside world is often cruel. But the language becomes dangerous when it prevents members from evaluating Dutch himself. If every criticism can be dismissed as the poison of civilization or lack of faith, Dutch becomes immune to correction. Dutch also depends on splitting, a psychological pattern where people are divided into loyal and disloyal, good and bad, faithful and traitorous. Early in the story, he can tolerate more complexity. By the end, complexity collapses. Arthur is with him or against him. John is loyal or a rat. Abigail is family or a problem. Micah is strong or weak, people hate him. This simplification helps Dutch manage stress, but it destroys his ability to lead reality. Grandiosity protects Dutch from shame. Shame is everywhere if he allows himself to feel it. Shame over Blackwater, shame over Jenny, Davy, Mac, Sean's capture, Jack's kidnapping, Hosea, Lenny, Molly, Kieran, Grimshaw, Arthur, John. The list of people harmed under his leadership grows unbearable. Grandiosity says, history is against us, but I am still chosen. Shame says, you led them here. Dutch chooses grandiosity because shame would break him. His speeches become more repetitive as his mind narrows. Earlier Dutch can sound expansive. Later he circles the same themes: faith, loyalty, noise, plans, betrayal. Repetition can be comforting when a leader is stable. In Dutch's case, it becomes evidence of mental constriction. He is no longer thinking forward creatively. He's using familiar phrases to hold himself together. There is also a performative masculinity in Dutch's decline. He increasingly values hardness, decisiveness, and violence over care, patience, or listening. Micah benefits from this because Micah frames brutality as realism. Hosea's caution becomes old weakness. Arthur's concern becomes doubt. Abigail's fear becomes inconvenience. Sadie's competence is useful, but not central. Dutch's world becomes more aggressively masculine as it becomes more fragile. Dutch's fear of dependency is hidden beneath his need for loyalty. He wants everyone dependent on him, but he cannot admit how dependent he is on them. He needs Arthur's labour, Hosea's wisdom, Molly's admiration, Micah's validation, the gang's belief, and enemies large enough to define him. Yet he presents himself as the source of strength. This contradiction becomes clearer when people begin pulling away. Dutch does not respond like a secure leader. He responds like a man losing pieces of himself. The head injury theory sometimes appears in discussions of Dutch because he suffers trauma during the trolley crash in St. Denis, and after that his behaviour seems to worsen. It is possible the injury contributes to disinhibition, irritability, or poor judgment, but the game is careful not to make this a complete explanation. Dutch's flaws exist before the crash. Blackwater happens before the crash. Bronte's killing is connected to humiliation before the crash. The injury may accelerate the collapse, but it does not create the man from nothing. That is psychologically more interesting anyway. If Dutch's decline were only brain damage, the moral tragedy would shrink. Instead, the trolley crash can be read as one more stressor on a mind already defending itself badly. Exhaustion, grief, injury, paranoia, and pressure all lower the walls. The impulses underneath come out more freely. The crash may not change Dutch's soul, but it may make it harder for him to hide from it. Dutch's idealization of freedom also deserves scrutiny. He speaks of freedom constantly, but his version of freedom is often freedom from accountability, freedom from law, from banks, from bosses, from government, from civilization. But what about the freedom of gang members to leave, the freedom of Arthur to question, the freedom of John to choose family, the freedom of Molly to be emotionally recognized? Dutch's freedom expands for himself and narrows for those around him. This contradiction reveals the authoritarian seed inside his anti-authoritarian language. Dutch hates being controlled from above, but he often expects to control those below him. He rejects hierarchy when he is under it, and reproduces hierarchy when he is at the top. That does not make his critique of society meaningless, it makes it incomplete. Dutch can identify tyranny outside himself, but not the tyranny he carries into the camp. Dutch's romanticism is another defence. He loves the idea of the noble outlaw, the last free men, the open country, the campfire family. Romanticism allows beauty, but it can also blur consequences. A robbed train becomes adventure, a shootout becomes resistance, a dead lawman becomes part of the struggle. Dutch's romance makes violence feel cleaner than it is. Arthur's late-game clarity cuts through this romance. He begins seeing blood as blood. Arthur's redemption threatens Dutch because it redefines the gang's values without Dutch's permission. Arthur starts acting according to the ideals Dutch preached but abandoned. Protect the vulnerable, be loyal to people, resist cruelty, help someone get free. Dutch cannot claim ownership over that because Arthur is doing it against Dutch's orders. This is the deepest insult to Dutch's ego. Arthur becomes the better expression of Dutch's own mythology. Dutch's collapse is also a study in moral injury. Moral injury happens when someone violates their own ethical code, or witnesses violations that shatter their sense of meaning. Dutch's code may be flexible, but he does seem to have one early on. As he violates it more often, he does not repair the injury through confession or change. He buries it under more action. Each buried violation makes the next easier. By Beaver Hollow, the moral injury has become moral numbness. Yet Dutch never becomes entirely flat. Even at the end there are flickers. His hesitation on the mountain, his shooting of Micah years later, his strange sadness in Red Dead Redemption 1. These moments suggest some part of Dutch knows. Not enough to repair, not enough to apologise properly, not enough to save Arthur, but enough to be haunted. Dutch is not frightening because he lacks conscience completely. He's frightening because he can silence it when it matters most, then live with the echo. Dutch's greatest psychological defence is myth-making. He mythologizes himself, the gang, the enemy, the future, the past, and every failure. Myth can inspire people. It can give the broken a reason to stand up. But myth becomes deadly when reality is forced to obey it. Dutch cannot adjust the myth when the facts change, so he adjusts the facts. Arthur is doubting. John is disloyal. Hosea would have understood. Micah is loyal. One more score will work. Tahiti is still possible. The story survives by eating reality. Arthur is Dutch's most important mirror because Arthur is the person Dutch most needs and most fears losing. Arthur does not flatter Dutch the way Micah does, and he does not drift like some of the younger members. Arthur works, Arthur provides, Arthur enforces. Arthur is the dependable arm of Dutch's will. For years, Dutch could dream because Arthur could make those dreams materially possible through violence, intimidation, and labour. Arthur is not just a son. He is Dutch's proof that the family still functions. This makes Arthur's moral awakening devastating to Dutch. When Arthur begins questioning him, Dutch cannot simply say Arthur is weak. Arthur has been strong for him for decades. He cannot say Arthur is selfish. Arthur has sacrificed constantly. He cannot say Arthur does not understand the life. Arthur understands it better than almost anyone. So Dutch reaches for the only explanation his ego can tolerate. Arthur is losing faith. Arthur is being influenced. Arthur is betraying him. Dutch has to reinterpret Arthur's conscience as disloyalty, because the alternative is admitting Arthur sees something true. Arthur's tuberculosis accelerates this because it removes Arthur from the old economy of usefulness. Earlier, Arthur's strength made him valuable. As he gets sick, his value becomes moral rather than physical. He sees more clearly, speaks more directly, and cares less about Dutch's approval. Dutch does not know how to handle an Arthur who is dying and therefore harder to control. A healthy Arthur can be sent on another job. A dying Arthur asks what the jobs are for. John represents the possibility of escape, which is why Dutch's feelings about him are so tangled. Dutch helped raise John, but John's deepest loyalty increasingly belongs to Abigail and Jack. That makes John both a son and a deserter in Dutch's emotional world. John wants out not because he hates the gang, but because he loves his family. Dutch experiences this as betrayal, because Dutch needs the gang to be the highest family. John's domestic desire undermines Dutch's mythic family structure. Dutch's resentment of John also has an old history. John left the gang for a period before the events of the game, abandoning Abigail and Jack. Arthur resents him for that too, but Arthur eventually recognizes John's attempt to become better. Dutch cannot or will not fully allow it. John growing into responsibility should be a victory for the gang's father figure. Instead, it threatens Dutch because it means a man can mature away from him. Abigail sees Dutch more clearly than many people because she does not need his mythology in the same way. Her priority is Jack. She has lived inside the gang, but she is not intoxicated by Dutch's speeches when her child is in danger. Abigail's practical love cuts through Dutch's grand language. This is why she becomes inconvenient. A mother asking for safety exposes how abstract Dutch's promises have become. Tahiti means nothing if Jack is dead, captured or raised in a collapsing camp. Jack is the moral test the gang repeatedly fails and sometimes passes. When he is kidnapped, everyone rallies. When the gang collapses, his safety becomes secondary to Dutch's plans unless Arthur and Abigail fight for it. Dutch enjoys the image of family, but a child requires concrete responsibility. Food, shelter, stability, protection, a future. Dutch can speak beautifully about family, but Jack reveals whether the family actually functions. By the end, it does not. Hosea's relationship with Dutch is old enough to contain memory before myth. Hosea remembers Dutch as a younger man, not only as the leader. That gives him power Dutch cannot easily replace. Hosea can tease him, challenge him, and remind him of practical limits. Their partnership likely worked because Hosea could translate Dutch's dreams into workable cons or talk him down from the worst impulses. When Hosea is alive, Dutch still has a witness to his earlier self. When Hosea dies, that witness disappears. Molly's tragedy is emotional neglect. She loves Dutch in a more romantic and personal way than the gang's collective devotion, but Dutch has little room for that once the relationship stops feeding his self-image. Molly is isolated in camp. She does not fit easily with the working women, the gunmen, or the old guard. She's close to Dutch, but not secure with him. Her loneliness becomes humiliating because everyone can see Dutch drifting away. Her false confession is less espionage than a final attempt to matter. Susan Grimshaw represents the internal discipline of the gang. She enforces order, especially among the women, and keeps camp functioning in ways Dutch often takes for granted. Grimshaw is loyal to Dutch, but she's also loyal to the camp as a structure. Her killing of Molly is brutal, but it comes from the gang's code. Later, when she sides with Arthur against Micah, it shows that her loyalty has limits. She can recognize when the family Dutch claims to protect has been betrayed from within. Javier's loyalty to Dutch is painful because Javier is not stupid or evil. He's a man who found belonging in the gang and clings to it as the world collapses. In the final standoff, Javier does not point his gun directly at Arthur and John in the same way others do, which suggests conflict inside him. He cannot fully turn on the men he rode with, but he also cannot let go of Dutch. Javier shows how loyalty can become paralysis, and someone cannot emotionally survive choosing against the leader. Bill Williamson's loyalty is different. Bill is insecure, often mocked, and desperate for a place where he matters. Dutch gives him that. Bill's dependence makes him easier to keep within the loyalist camp. He may not understand Dutch's ideology deeply, but he understands the emotional bargain. Dutch makes him feel included, so he follows Dutch even when the direction becomes rotten. Bill's later life in Red Dead Redemption shows that without Dutch's structure, he becomes a crude imitation of outlaw leadership. Charles Smith functions as a moral contrast to Dutch. Charles is quiet, practical, and deeply ethical without needing speeches. He helps because helping is right. He protects people without building a mythology around himself. He distrusts unnecessary cruelty. Dutch talks constantly about freedom and justice, but Charles often embodies those values more honestly. That contrast exposes Dutch's theatricality. Charles does not need to declare himself a good man every hour because his behaviour speaks. Lenny Summers is one of the gang's clearest examples of Dutch's better dream. Young, intelligent, black, politically aware, and hunted by a racist society, Lenny finds in the gang a place where his mind is valued. Dutch's anti-civilization rhetoric likely resonates with Lenny because Lenny knows civilization's hypocrisy intimately. His death in St. Denis is not only a tactical loss, it is the death of one of the futures the gang claim to protect. Tilly Jackson also represents the gang's refuge function. Dutch's group gives her protection after a dangerous past with the Foreman brothers. In a harsher world, the gang can be sanctuary. That is why the collapse is so morally tragic. Dutch built something that genuinely sheltered vulnerable people. Then his ego and delusion helped turn that shelter into another dangerous place they had to escape. Sadie Adler enters the gang through catastrophe after the O'Driscolls murder her husband and destroy her home. Dutch's gang saves her from the immediate aftermath, but Sadie's later growth does not depend on Dutch in the same way Arthur's does. She becomes fierce, vengeful, loyal to Arthur, and increasingly independent. By the end, Sadie sees through Dutch because her loyalty is grounded in action, not mythology. She cares who shows up. Arthur shows up. Dutch does not. Micah, of course, is the most psychologically revealing relationship because Dutch chooses him when the gang is breaking. Micah offers no moral wisdom, no family warmth, no caution, no love for the vulnerable. What he offers is validation. He tells Dutch that the doubters are weak, that the hard choices are necessary, that loyalty means obedience, and that violence proves strength. Dutch's choice of Micah over Arthur is the moment his ego chooses flattery over love. Micah also gives Dutch permission to become simpler. Earlier, Dutch is complicated. Philosopher, father, outlaw, idealist. Micah pushes him toward a cruder identity. Strong men take, weak people complain, doubters are traitors, survival belongs to the ruthless. This simplification is appealing to a stressed mind. Complexity requires guilt and reflection. Micah offers clarity without conscience. Reverend Swanson, Uncle, Pearson, Mary Beth, Karen, Sean, Kieran and the rest of the gang all reveal the same larger truth. Dutch's family contains real people with different needs, wounds and futures. But as Dutch collapses, the individual lives matter less to him than the loyalty map. Who is with me? Who doubts me? Who is useful? Who is a problem? A real family notices individual suffering. A collapsing cult notices allegiance. The entire collapse of the Van Der Linde gang can be seen as a family system breaking under the weight of one man's ego. Hosea is the moderating parent. Arthur is the responsible son. John is the son trying to leave home. Abigail is the outsider who sees the danger because her loyalty is to her child first. Micah is the abusive new influence who flatters the patriarch. Molly is the neglected partner. The younger members are children watching the adults fail. Dutch is the father who insists the family is strong while making it unsafe to tell the truth. This is why camp atmosphere is so important. Early camps feel alive with songs, chores, jokes, arguments, and ordinary warmth. Later camps feel tense, suspicious, and fragmented. The physical space reflects Dutch's mind. Horseshoe Overlook still feels like a possibility. Clemens Point feels like a brief summer lie. Shady Bell feels haunted by decay. Beaver Hollow feels like the inside of a sick animal. As Dutch collapses, the gang's homes become darker, more cramped, and less human. Coulter, the first camp, shows Dutch as crisis leader. The gang is cold, frightened, and still bleeding from Blackwater. In that environment, Dutch's confidence is useful. People need someone to speak as if tomorrow exists. His speeches in the snow are not empty. They keep the group from dissolving. That is part of why the later collapse is so painful. Dutch's gift is real. In the right moment he can hold panic together with sheer force of personality. But even in Coulter there are signs of distortion. Dutch frames the gang's suffering as temporary, as something they will push through because they are different from ordinary people. He rarely lets the possibility of his own responsibility settle in the open air. Blackwater is a disaster, but Dutch turns attention towards survival, faith, and the enemy. In a crisis, that can be necessary. But if a leader never returns to accountability after the crisis passes, emergency rhetoric becomes a permanent shield. Horseshoe Overlook is the gang at its most deceptively healthy. The camp is beautiful, open, and full of light. People laugh. Javier sings, Pearson cooks, Hosea plans, Arthur rides out and brings money back, Dutch reads and dreams. For many players, Horseshoe feels like home because it presents the gang's mythology at its warmest. If the story ended there, Dutch might feel like a flawed but inspiring father figure. The tragedy is that Horseshoe is not a lie exactly. It is a temporary truth that cannot survive pressure. At Horseshoe, Dutch still listens to Hosea more often. He can be challenged. He can laugh. He can present himself as confident without yet sounding completely desperate. But the seeds of future disaster are present in the Cornwall train robbery, in the choice to keep escalating, and in the refusal to become small and quiet for long enough to survive. Dutch says they need money, but he also needs motion. Stillness would mean facing the question no one wants to ask. What if the age of the gang is already over? Clemens Point feels warmer, but it is also where Dutch's appetite for manipulation expands. The gang becomes involved in the feud between the Greys and Braithwaites, playing both sides for profit. On paper, it is a classic con. In practice, it reveals a dangerous confidence. Dutch believes he can step into a generations-old blood feud and outplay everyone. Hosea participates too, but the entire Rhodes chapter carries a sense of the gang becoming too comfortable with deception. They think they are the clever predators until Jack is taken and the illusion collapses. Jack's kidnapping is a major emotional rupture, because it attacks the gang's self-image as a family. They may rob, kill and deceive outsiders, but Jack is supposed to be protected. When the Braithwaites take him, the gang's revenge is immediate and terrifying. Dutch leads them to Braithwaite Manor with a kind of righteous fury. In that moment, his violence is aligned with the audience's anger. He is protecting family. That is why Dutch remains compelling. The same man who will later abandon John and Abigail can earlier seem like a father avenging a stolen child. But even this righteous violence feeds Dutch's self-concept. He is the protector. He is the leader who storms the manor. He is the man nobody should cross. The gang's loyalty is reinforced by moments like this because Dutch appears at his best when an external enemy clearly deserves punishment. The problem is that later, when the enemy is not external but internal doubt, Dutch uses similar emotional intensity against his own people. Shady Belle is where decay enters the home itself. The old plantation house is large, haunted and uncomfortable. It gives the gang shelter, but not peace. St. Denis is nearby, representing modern civilization in its most overwhelming form. Police, banks, industry, wealth, crowds, and surveillance. Dutch wants to beat this world, but he does not understand it as well as he thinks. The city is not a frontier town that can be intimidated. It is a machine. In St. Denis, Dutch begins looking smaller even when he speaks grandly. Angelo Bronte humiliates the gang by presenting himself as a civilized criminal with deeper connections and more polished power. Bronte takes Jack, then returns him, then manipulates Dutch into the trolley station disaster. Dutch responds not only as a strategist but as a wounded ego. Bronte makes him feel foolish, and Dutch cannot tolerate feeling foolish. The killing of Bronte is another psychological line. Dutch drowns him and feeds him to an alligator. It is not enough to kill him. The death has to become symbolic, degrading, theatrical. Arthur and John are disturbed. Dutch frames it as justice, but it feels like revenge contaminated by humiliation. Bronte did not only endanger the gang, he mocked Dutch's self-image. Dutch's violence becomes more excessive when his pride is injured. The St. Denis bank robbery is the moment the gang's dream receives a wound it cannot survive. Hosea dies, Lenny dies. John is captured. The plan fails. The city wins. The old style of outlaw confidence is crushed by modern law and Pinkerton pressure. Dutch escapes physically, but psychologically he loses the last illusion that cleverness and boldness will always find a door. After that, his plans become less like strategy and more like compulsions. Guama removes Dutch from his stage. There is no full gang to address, no familiar camp, no Hosea, no Abigail, no Grimshaw, no songs. Just a handful of men in a colonial nightmare. Without the larger family structure, Dutch's instability becomes easier to see. He cannot perform benevolent patriarch as convincingly there. He becomes harsher, quicker, more openly paranoid. The cave with Gloria shows what Dutch looks like when the speech falls away and only suspicion remains. Lakay, after the return from Guama, feels like a fever. The gang is back but not restored. Everyone is scattered, frightened, and exhausted. The Pinkertons arrive almost immediately, proving that even escape no longer creates safety. Dutch's leadership after Guama is reactive. He no longer seems to guide events so much as lunge at them. The gang survives, but the emotional centre is cracking. Beaver Hollow is the final psychological landscape. It is dark, cramped, and infected with dread. The camp's physical ugliness mirrors Dutch's mental state. Earlier camps had horizons. Beaver Hollow has walls, mud, shadows, and rot. People whisper. Arthur coughs. Micah looms. Dutch speaks of plans that sound less and less attached to reality. If Horseshoe was the myth of the gang, Beaver Hollow is the truth of what the myth has become. Beaver Hollow is especially symbolic. The gang ends in a cave associated with death, sickness, and rot. Arthur is dying of tuberculosis. The Murphy Brood presence lingers in the space. People are frightened. The light is poor. The dream of open freedom has become a hole in the earth. Dutch still talks, but the environment tells the truth. They are not on the edge of paradise, they are underground. Dutch's speeches at Beaver Hollow sound increasingly disconnected from the faces around him. People are hungry, grieving, afraid, and exhausted. Dutch talks about loyalty and plans. The gap between rhetoric and reality becomes unbearable. This is what happens when a leader falls in love with his own language. Words that once gave comfort begin to sound like noise because the people listening can compare them with what is happening in front of them. One of Dutch's most revealing habits is that he often answers concrete fear with abstract language. Someone is worried about food, money, lawmen, or a missing person, and Dutch rises into talk of faith, freedom, and the bigger picture. Abstraction is useful for leadership because it keeps people from drowning in immediate panic. But abstraction also becomes a way to avoid specifics. The more specific the problem becomes, the more abstract Dutch tends to sound. When the gang is starving in Coulter, abstraction gives them warmth. When they're trapped in Beaver Hollow, abstraction becomes insulting. This shift matters. The same tool can heal or harm depending on whether reality is being faced. Early Dutch uses grand language to help people endure hardship. Late Dutch uses grand language to deny that his choices are creating hardship. The difference is not in the vocabulary, it is in the relationship between words and reality. Dutch also often speaks in collective pronouns: we, us, our. This makes his plans feel shared even when he is the one defining them. We need money, we need faith, we are going to be free, we are being hunted, we cannot give up. The pronoun creates unity, but it can also blur responsibility. If we failed, Dutch did not fail alone. If we need one more score, Dutch is not imposing a desire. The group supposedly shares it. Language spreads accountability thin. But when loyalty is questioned, Dutch's language narrows. He begins separating people into those with him and those against him. The warm we becomes conditional. Arthur can feel this change. John can feel it. The gang's family language becomes less inclusive and more disciplinary. This is often how controlling leaders use belonging. Inclusion is offered as a reward for compliance, not as a stable bond. Dutch's anger often arrives when someone interrupts the story he is telling about himself. Arthur does this repeatedly late in the game. Arthur asks practical questions. What about Abigail? What about John? What about the people who are dying? Dutch hears these as attacks because they drag him out of the mythic future and into the moral present. The present is where Dutch is weakest. He is strongest when talking about what will happen soon, once everyone trusts him enough. Mary Beth's presence in camp also quietly exposes Dutch. She's a romantic writer, someone who understands stories, fantasy and performance. Early on, the gang itself feels like one of those romantic outlaw tales, but by the end, the romance has become horror. Mary Beth survives by leaving, and later, she becomes a writer. There is something fitting about that. She escapes Dutch's failing story and writes her own. Karen's decline is another sign of the family failing. She is lively, sharp, and funny early in the game, but grief and alcohol consume her after Sean's death and the gang's collapse. Dutch does not save her. The camp that once gave people identity cannot hold her pain. Karen's fading presence shows that not every tragedy gets a dramatic mission. Some people simply disappear into sorrow while the louder plot moves on. Kieran Duffy's death is one of the most horrific reminders that the gang's enemies are real, but it also reveals the limits of Dutch's family. Kieran begins as an O'Driscoll prisoner, slowly becomes tolerated, and even starts to find a place. His murder by the O'Driscolls is brutal, and the gang responds violently. But his earlier treatment also shows how conditional belonging can be. He has to earn humanity in the eyes of people who are themselves constantly demanding humanity from the world. Sean's return after being rescued gives the gang a burst of joy. People celebrate. The camp feels alive. Dutch thrives in these moments because they validate the family myth. He can preside over laughter and reunion. Yet Sean's later death shows how fragile those highs are. The gang's emotional life becomes a cycle of reunion, celebration, disaster, revenge, and grief. Dutch keeps promising the cycle will end after the next success, but the cycle is the life. Dutch's interaction with Uncle is often comic, but even Uncle serves a psychological function. Uncle mocks, complains, and deflates seriousness. In a healthier group, that kind of figure can keep grandiosity from becoming unbearable, but Uncle is not respected enough to truly challenge Dutch. His jokes bounce off the surface. Zaya's humour could correct Dutch. Uncle's humour usually only irritates or amuses. The difference shows how much status matters when speaking truth to a charismatic leader. Pearson represents the ordinary maintenance Dutch's dream depends on but rarely honours. Someone has to cook. Someone has to manage supplies. Someone has to make the camp livable. Dutch speaks about freedom, but freedom still needs stew, coffee, ammunition, and clean clothes. The practical labour of camp life is often done by people Dutch's grand story does not centre. This is true of many romantic movements. The speeches are remembered, but the chores keep people alive. Strauss is tolerated because he brings money, but his presence corrodes the gang's self-image. Dutch can condemn bankers because bankers are outside enemies. Strauss brings the logic of debt inside camp. Arthur eventually expels him because Arthur's conscience can no longer bear the contradiction. Dutch never takes that step himself, which says a lot. He rejects the civilization of debt in Rhetoric, but accepts its profits when convenient. Dutch's relationship to violence also changes in texture. Early violence is often framed as defense, survival, or retaliation. Later violence feels more impulsive, symbolic, or unnecessary. Drowning Bronte, killing Gloria, using the Wapiti conflict, abandoning rescues, escalating against Cornwall. The body count is not the only issue. The meaning of violence changes. It stops serving the family's survival and starts serving Dutch's need to reassert control. This is why Arthur's face during certain Dutch scenes matters. Red Dead Redemption 2 often lets Arthur react quietly. A look, a pause, a lowered voice. Arthur does not need to give a speech about Dutch changing every time. The player sees him registering the shift. Because Arthur is usually so loyal, his silence becomes evidence. If Arthur is disturbed, something is truly wrong. Dutch uses the word noise in interesting ways. He often complains about noise, chaos and distractions, but he creates much of it. This is a psychological projection. He experiences the consequences of his decisions as external disorder. The gang is noisy because people are afraid. The law is noisy because Dutch escalated. Arthur is noisy because Dutch refuses to hear him. By calling it noise, Dutch can avoid treating it as information. He also speaks often of needing time. Time for the plan. Time for faith to pay off. Time to get money. Time to escape. But time is exactly what the gang does not have. Arthur is dying. The Pinkertons are closing in. The world is modernizing. John's family needs safety now. Dutch's demand for more time becomes another way of postponing truth. He keeps asking people to lend him a future he has not earned. There is a strong contrast between Dutch and Rainsfall in how they handle powerlessness. Rainsfall has every reason to rage. His people are being exploited, lied to, and pushed toward destruction. But he chooses restraint because he knows rage can be used by enemies. Dutch, who claims to fight oppression, cannot resist using Eaglefly's rage for tactical advantage. Rainsfall is not weak, he is disciplined. Dutch mistakes discipline for passivity, because discipline does not flatter his appetite for dramatic action. Dutch's scene with Cornwall in Ansburg reveals his need to personalise systems. Cornwall is a man, and killing him feels satisfying, but the structures Cornwall represents continue. Capital does not die because one capitalist is shot. The Pinkertons do not vanish. The railroad does not stop. The government does not forget. Dutch keeps trying to solve systemic defeat through personal confrontation, because personal confrontation is where he can still feel powerful. The same pattern appears with Bronte. St. Denis humiliates Dutch as a system. Urban density, police coordination, political connections, money, surveillance. Dutch turns that humiliation into a personal enemy named Bronte. Killing Bronte feels like reclaiming dominance, but it does not solve St. Denis. In fact, it helps lead the gang deeper into disaster. Dutch keeps confusing symbolic revenge with strategic progress. Arthur's late-game question, whether Dutch has become more like Micah or Micah has simply revealed him, sits under much of the ending. It is tempting to blame Micah for everything because Micah is so obviously poisonous, but Micah's role is more disturbing than that. He reveals Dutch's susceptibility. He shows that Dutch would rather hear a cruel man praise him than a loyal man challenge him. Micah is the test. Dutch fails. The gang's women often see practical danger earlier than Dutch acknowledges. Abigail wants safety. Tilly wants survival. Mary Beth senses the story turning ugly. Grimshaw senses betrayal. Sadie acts decisively. Molly collapses under neglect. Dutch's grand male outlaw fantasy often marginalizes the people most aware of the household reality. This is another reason his leadership fails. He listens to the voices that feed the myth and dismisses the voices that describe the home. Dutch's love of books and philosophy can make him seem enlightened compared with rougher outlaws, but education does not immunize a person against self-deception. Sometimes it makes self-deception more elaborate. Dutch can use beautiful ideas to rationalize ugly acts. He can quote civilization's critics while building his own little tyranny. Intelligence gives him better tools for justification. It does not automatically produce wisdom. This is why Hosea's wisdom feels different from Dutch's intelligence. Hosea is clever, but he is grounded in human outcomes. He asks whether plans will work, who might get hurt, whether the risk is worth it. Dutch asks whether the plan fits the dream. Hosea's mind moves toward consequences. Dutch's mind moves toward meaning. A group needs both, but when meaning detaches from consequences, people die. After Hosea dies, Dutch seems to lose the part of the gang that could translate meaning back into consequence. Arthur tries to take that role, but Dutch cannot accept it from Arthur, because Arthur is below him in the family hierarchy. Hosea could correct Dutch as an equal. Arthur's correction feels like rebellion. This is why the same warning might be heard differently depending on who speaks it. Dutch's ego can tolerate some truths only from certain mouths. The father-son dynamic with Arthur makes this worse. A son surpassing a father morally can trigger shame. Arthur's clarity implies Dutch's failure. Dutch cannot receive Arthur's care as care because it arrives attached to judgment. Arthur is trying to save what remains. Dutch feels accused. Both things are true, but Dutch responds only to the accusation. Dutch's inability to apologize is one of his defining weaknesses. A real apology would require him to name harm without immediately turning it into a speech about circumstances. He almost never does this. He expresses regret in broad, dramatic ways, but he does not sit inside specific responsibility. He mourns losses, but mourning is not apology. He grieves Hosea, but does not say, "My decisions helped lead him there." He sees Arthur dying, but does not say, "I failed you." This inability is central to his collapse. Groups can survive mistakes if leaders can admit them and change course. Dutch cannot. Every mistake must be integrated into the myth. The myth becomes heavier and more distorted until it breaks. By the time he might apologize, the emotional vocabulary for apology is gone. All he has left is silence and departure. Arthur's journal captures the slow disillusionment in a quieter way. He writes about Dutch changing, about not understanding him, about the gang falling apart. Arthur is not an academic psychologist, but he observes with painful honesty. The journal shows a man trying to process the collapse of his faith. He does not immediately reject Dutch. He mourns him before he condemns him. That is exactly how betrayal by a parental figure often feels. The anger comes with grief attached. There is also an aging element in Dutch's psychology. The world is modernizing and Dutch is getting older. He can no longer rely on the same tricks, roots and myths. Younger men like Cornwall's agents, government forces and Pinkertons represent systems that do not care about Dutch's romance of outlaw freedom. Dutch experiences this not only as strategic pressure, but as narcissistic injury. The world is telling him he is becoming irrelevant, and he cannot bear it. Dutch's hatred of civilization is partly ideological and partly personal. Civilization means fences, banks, factories, laws, surveillance, wage labour, and the death of open outlaw possibility. But it also means Dutch cannot remain the hero of his own frontier myth forever. The future has no throne for him, so he frames the future as moral corruption. Again, he is not entirely wrong. The future in Red Dead is brutal, but Dutch's critique is contaminated by his need to remain grand. This is why he is such a strong character. A worse story would make Dutch either a pure fraud or a pure fallen angel. Red Dead Redemption 2 lets him be both sincere and poisonous. He can correctly identify real injustice and still exploit the people closest to him. He can love Arthur and still abandon him. He can mourn Hosea and still ignore what Hosea would have advised. He can hate tyranny and still become tyrannical inside his own family. The psychological horror of Dutch Van Der Linde is that he makes loyalty feel noble until loyalty becomes self-erasure. Arthur spends years believing that loyalty is one of his highest virtues. By the end, he realizes loyalty to Dutch may require betraying everything decent left in him. Arthur's redemption begins when he separates loyalty from obedience. He remains loyal to people, but not to Dutch's delusion. He saves John's family because that is what the gang's ideals should have meant. This is the key difference between Dutch and Arthur at the end. Dutch is loyal to the idea of the gang as long as the idea centers him. Arthur becomes loyal to the actual people who can still be saved. Dutch protects the myth. Arthur protects the living. That is why Arthur surpasses Dutch morally, even though Dutch raised him. The student finally understands the lesson better than the teacher ever did. In the end, Dutch is a portrait of charismatic collapse. He shows how a leader can begin with real generosity and still become destructive when ego, fear and fantasy go unchallenged. He shows how ideals can become weapons when they are tied too tightly to one man's need to be believed. He shows how love can become control when the person giving it cannot tolerate independence. And he shows how a family can be destroyed not only by enemies outside it, but by the stories it refuses to stop telling about itself. If we were to build a full psychological profile of Dutch, the first trait would be charisma fused with dependency. Dutch appears independent, but he depends intensely on the emotional reactions of others. He needs admiration, loyalty, and belief. He needs people to look at him and see a leader, not a frightened man improvising. When they do, he becomes powerful. When they stop, he becomes dangerous. The second trait would be ideological narcissism. Dutch's self-love is not only about his appearance or status, it is tied to his ideas. He does not merely think he is impressive, he thinks his worldview is morally elevated. This makes disagreement feel like more than disagreement. If Dutch's ideas are noble, and Dutch embodies them, then questioning Dutch becomes a kind of moral failure in his eyes. That is how ideology becomes armour for ego. The third trait would be reality avoidance through future fantasy. Dutch is always pointing toward a coming escape. One more score, enough money, a new place, a clean start, Tahiti. The future absorbs the guilt of the present. Today's suffering is acceptable because tomorrow will redeem it. But tomorrow never comes. The fantasy must remain ahead because if it arrives, it can be tested and found empty. The fourth trait would be paranoia under pressure. Dutch is capable of warmth and intelligence when he feels secure, but under threat, his mind sorts people into loyal and disloyal too quickly. He becomes less curious, less reflective, and more punitive. He stops asking whether criticism is true and starts asking what criticism says about allegiance. This destroys the feedback system any leader needs to survive. The fifth trait would be moral compartmentalization. Dutch can condemn exploitation while benefiting from Strauss's loans. He can preach family while neglecting Molly. He can talk about loyalty while abandoning John. He can denounce tyranny while manipulating eagle flies. He can grieve Hosea while ignoring Hosea's caution. These contradictions do not stop him because he keeps them in separate rooms inside his mind. The walls between those rooms only collapse near the end. The sixth trait would be performative intimacy. Dutch can make people feel seen, especially when he first brings them in. He knows how to speak to pain. He knows how to offer belonging. But long-term intimacy requires receiving other people's needs when they do not serve your self-image. Dutch struggles there. Molly's neediness irritates him. John's family loyalty threatens him. Arthur's honesty wounds him. Dutch is good at the grand gesture of family and poor at the humble labour of it. The seventh trait would be escalating risk as identity defence. Many of Dutch's worst plans are not only attempts to get money, they are attempts to prove that Dutch is still Dutch, still clever, still bold, still free, still ahead of the law, still capable of beating the system. As the world proves otherwise, the risks grow. The plans become less rational because their purpose becomes emotional restoration. The eighth trait would be grief turned outward. Dutch loses people, but instead of letting grief humble him, he often lets it harden him. Annabelle's death feeds the column feud. Hosea's death feeds paranoia and escalation. The gang's losses feed blame rather than accountability. Dutch does not lack feeling. He feels deeply. The problem is what he does with feeling. He transforms grief into justification. The ninth trait would be envy of the future. Dutch talks about hating civilization, but underneath is a fear that the future has no place for him. John can become a rancher. Jack can become something else. Arthur can die redeemed. Abigail can imagine ordinary safety. Dutch cannot. His identity is too bound to being outside the world. If the outlaw age ends, Dutch does not know who he is. That fear makes him fight history as if history were a personal enemy. The 10th trait would be tragic self-awareness that arrives too late. Dutch is not completely blind. That may be the most haunting part. In certain moments he seems to know something has gone wrong. He hesitates. He falls silent. He looks shaken. But insight without action becomes another form of cowardice. Dutch can glimpse the truth, but he cannot stay with it long enough to repair anything. By the time he acts against Micah, the people who needed him to act are already dead. This profile makes Dutch feel painfully human. Not sympathetic in a way that excuses him, but recognisable. Many people have seen smaller versions of Dutch in life. The charismatic leader who cannot be wrong, the parent whose love depends on obedience, the idealist who uses the cause to avoid apologising, the friend who turns every criticism into betrayal, the dreamer who keeps promising that everything will be better after one more sacrifice. Dutch is grand because the game is grand, but his psychology is familiar. That familiarity is why he stays with players. We are not only watching a fictional outlaw lose his mind, we are watching the way charm can curdle into control, how ideals can protect ego, how family language can hide emotional coercion, and how a person can be right about the world's cruelty while wrong, about almost everything he does in response. Dutch is not scary, because he is obviously monstrous from the start. He is scary because you can understand why people loved him. And maybe that is the deepest tragedy of Arthur's story too. Arthur's heartbreak is not that he followed a fool, it is that he followed someone who once gave him something real. Dutch gave Arthur literacy, identity, belonging, and a moral vocabulary, even if that vocabulary later broke down. Arthur cannot simply discard Dutch without discarding part of himself. His redemption requires keeping what was true and rejecting what became poisonous. That is what mature disillusionment looks like. Arthur does not decide every ideal Dutch taught was worthless. He decides Dutch no longer lives up to them. There is a difference. Arthur still believes in loyalty, but he redirects it toward John's family. He still believes in resisting cruelty, but he stops excusing the gang's cruelty. He still believes people can change, because he changes. In the end, Arthur saves the best parts of Dutch's dream from Dutch himself. Dutch Van Der Linde, psychologically, is a man destroyed by the inability to separate the dream from the dreamer. If freedom belongs to everyone, Dutch could step aside, apologise, adapt, or let others leave. But if freedom is something only Dutch can lead them to, then every challenge becomes betrayal, and every failure becomes someone else's fault. That confusion kills the gang. Dutch mistakes his own centrality for the cause. This is why the title of leader becomes a prison for him. Dutch cannot be ordinary within the family he created. He cannot say, "I am scared." He cannot say, "I was wrong." He cannot say, "Hosea would have known better." He cannot say, "Arthur, you see this more clearly than I do." Those admissions would make him human, and Dutch has spent too long being larger than human. So he becomes smaller while trying to remain grand. The most devastating contrast is between Dutch's words and Arthur's actions. Dutch says, "Have faith." Arthur shows faith by going back for John. Dutch says family. Arthur protects Abigail and Jack. Dutch says freedom. Arthur gives John a chance to live outside the gang. Dutch says loyalty. Arthur remains loyal to what is right even when it costs him Dutch's approval. Dutch keeps the language. Arthur keeps the meaning. By the final mountain, Dutch is surrounded by the ruins of his own vocabulary. Faith has become denial. Loyalty has become obedience. Freedom has become flight. Family has become faction. Plans have become compulsions. The words still exist, but Arthur can no longer live inside them. That is why he says Micah is the rat, why he says he gave Dutch all he had, why his voice carries exhaustion more than anger. He is not debating anymore. He is saying goodbye to a religion that failed him. Dutch's silence is the only honest answer he has left. For once, he cannot outtalk the truth. He cannot produce a speech that makes Arthur's dying body, Micah's betrayal, John's abandonment, and the gang's collapse fit into a noble plan. He can only stand there, trapped between the man he claimed to be and the man his choices revealed. Then he walks away. It is worth being careful with psychological labels, because Dutch is not a real patient sitting in a chair. He is a fictional outlaw written to carry themes of charisma, collapse, ideology, and betrayal. Calling him narcissistic, paranoid, or messianic can be useful, but only if those words help us see the story more clearly rather than flatten him into a checklist. Dutch is compelling because he remains dramatically human. He is not a diagnosis. He is a person-shaped tragedy about what happens when a man cannot let his self-image die. The better question is not simply what disorder Dutch has. The better question is what psychological needs drive his choices. He needs admiration. He needs control over the story. He needs the gang to prove his worldview. He needs enemies large enough to make him feel righteous. He needs a future paradise to delay shame. He needs doubters to be wrong. He needs Micah's flattery after Hosea's correction is gone. These needs explain more than any single label could. Dutch's need for admiration is not always obvious, because he wraps it in service. He does not say, "Worship me." He says, "Trust me." He says, "Have faith." He says, "We are family." But admiration is there in the emotional structure. He wants people to see him as the one who knows, the one who leads, the one who understands the world's lies. When people admire him, he becomes generous and expansive. When admiration turns into doubt, his warmth cools quickly. His need to control the story is even stronger. Dutch can survive hunger, pursuit, cold, and danger, but he cannot survive a narrative where he is merely wrong. That is why he keeps reframing. Blackwater is not his failure. It is bad luck, pressure, betrayal, a world closing in. St. Denis is not proof of recklessness. It is another sign they need more faith. Arthur's doubt is not wisdom. It is disloyalty. Story control is emotional survival. The gang itself functions as Dutch's living audience. Around the campfire, on jobs, in speeches, during arguments, Dutch is constantly being watched. Leadership is performance, and performance becomes addictive. A performer who has spent decades being believed may eventually confuse applause with truth. Dutch's tragedy is that he cannot step off the stage. Even when the tent is burning down, he keeps performing the role of the man with the plan. The camp locations symbolize this stage collapsing. Horseshoe Overlook gives Dutch a beautiful theatre, open air, morning light, songs, and the feeling of possibility. Clemens Point gives him a lakeside stage for charming manipulation. Shady Bell gives him a decaying mansion, fitting for a man whose grandeur is starting to rot. Beaver Hollow gives him a cave. By the end, the stage has become a tomb. Dutch keeps speaking, but the scenery has turned against him. His clothing also matters. Dutch dresses like a man committed to elegance even while living in mud. That elegance is part dignity and part denial. He refuses to look like what the world says he is, a desperate criminal being hunted into extinction. He dresses like a gentleman rebel, someone with taste, education and control. As everything falls apart, the maintained appearance becomes more tragic. The costume survives longer than the moral structure underneath it. Dutch's pipe, books, tent, and gramophone-like touches of refinement show the same thing. He wants culture inside outlaw life. He wants to prove that being outside the law does not mean being crude. This is one of his appealing qualities. He gives the gang more than survival. He gives them songs, readings, ideals, and a sense of style. But those same refinements help hide the violence. A beautiful sentence can sit beside an ugly act, and Dutch is very good at making people look at the sentence. The contrast with Micah's ugliness is deliberate. Micah is openly vile, so the player can hate him easily. Dutch is harder because he has beauty around him. His voice, ideals, memories, and fatherly history make his cruelty feel like a betrayal rather than a simple fact. Micah is a predator. Dutch is a fallen patriarch. Micah destroys because he enjoys it. Dutch destroys while insisting he is saving something. That makes Dutch more psychologically complex. Dutch's relationship to death is also revealing. He can mourn dramatically, but he often moves quickly from mourning into meaning. Meaning can help grief, but it can also prevent grief from being felt honestly. If every death becomes sacrifice for the cause, then Dutch does not have to sit with the possibility that the cause killed them. Jenny, Davy, Mac, Sean, Kieran, Hosea, Lenny, Molly, Grimshaw, Arthur. The names pile up. Dutch cannot let the pile mean what it means. Arthur eventually does let it mean something. His journal, his conversations with Sister Calderon or Reverend Swanson depending on the path, his help for the Downs family and his final choices all show a man allowing reality to wound him. Arthur becomes better not because he escapes guilt, but because he stops running from it. Dutch becomes worse because he runs faster. Sister Calderon's conversation with Arthur is one of the strongest contrasts to Dutch's worldview. She offers no grand plan, no paradise, no revolution, no speech about faith in a leader. She offers humility, compassion, and the possibility that helping someone is enough. Arthur admits he is afraid. That admission is something Dutch almost never allows himself. Arthur's fear becomes humanizing. Dutch's refusal of fear becomes dehumanizing. This is why vulnerability is central to the difference between them. Arthur becomes vulnerable and finds moral clarity. Dutch avoids vulnerability and loses clarity. He cannot say he is afraid of irrelevance, afraid of failure, afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing his family, afraid that Hosea's death is partly on him, afraid that Arthur sees him clearly. Since he cannot speak fear, It emerges as anger, blame, and urgency. Dutch's urgency is contagious. He often makes people feel that there is no time to think, only to act. This is a classic pressure mechanism. If people slow down, they may question. If they question, the plan may collapse. So Dutch keeps the gang moving. Another job, another camp, another enemy, another promise. Movement substitutes for progress. By the time people realize they are not getting closer to freedom, they have already lost so much. The phrase, "we just need more money," is almost hypnotic because it sounds practical. Money is real. They do need it. But the deeper need is not financial. The deeper need is for a clean ending to a dirty life. Dutch wants enough money to convert every robbery, death, and betrayal into a meaningful journey. No amount of money can do that. You cannot buy retroactive innocence. That is why Arthur's redemption is not financial. He does not earn enough to save everyone. He does not find the perfect score. He does not defeat the Pinkertons. He chooses a moral direction with the little time he has left. Red Dead Redemption 2 quietly argues that redemption is not the same as escape. Dutch wants escape. Arthur finds redemption. Those are not the same thing. Dutch cannot understand this because redemption would require confession. He would have to say, "I used people. I was wrong. I let Micah poison me. I abandoned my sons. I turned a family into a shield for my ego." That level of confession would destroy the myth. Dutch might survive physically, but the Dutch he knows would die. So instead, he lets other people die to keep the myth alive a little longer. The gang members who leave or survive often do so by stepping outside Dutch's emotional weather. Mary Beth becomes a writer. Tilly builds a stable life. Pearson runs a shop. Charles helps people and later leaves. Sadie becomes a bounty hunter, still wounded but self-directed. John tries ranching. These futures are imperfect, but they prove Dutch was wrong that the gang was the only possible family. People can leave the myth and still exist. Dutch's tragedy is that he cannot. He outlives the gang, but not the myth. By Red Dead Redemption 1, he is still performing resistance in a world that has already absorbed the old outlaw drama into history. He becomes almost like a man repeating a speech after the audience has left. John is the last person who can understand the old language, and even John is there under government orders. We are proving that the new world has learned how to use former outlaws against each other. The entire Red Dead saga makes Dutch both wrong and prophetic. He's wrong about himself, wrong about loyalty, wrong about the gang's future, wrong to trust Micah, wrong to use people as pieces in his dream. But he is right that the modern world is brutal. He is right that powerful men write laws to protect their interests. He is right that freedom is being fenced and sold. The pain is that being right about injustice does not make him just. That distinction is one of the most mature ideas in Red Dead Redemption 2. A person can correctly criticize society and still be abusive. A leader can speak truth about oppression and still oppress the people closest to him. A dream can be beautiful and still become deadly in the wrong hands. Yet Dutch forces the player to hold those truths together. Rejecting Dutch does not mean embracing Cornwall. Seeing Cornwall's evil does not excuse Dutch. In psychological terms, Dutch externalizes evil. The evil is civilization. Cornwall, Colum, Bronte, the Pinkertons, the government, traitors, doubters, rats. Some of those enemies are real. But because evil is always outside, Dutch does not have to integrate his own capacity for harm. Arthur's journey is the opposite. Arthur internalizes guilt, sometimes too much, but eventually uses it to change. Dutch externalizes guilt and uses it to escalate. This is why the player's perspective through Arthur is so important. If the game were only from Dutch's point of view, his speeches might dominate the moral atmosphere. If it were only from an outsider's view, Dutch might seem obviously manipulative. Through Arthur, we feel the old love and the new doubt at the same time. We understand why Dutch mattered before we fully condemn what he becomes. That emotional sequencing is the genius of the writing. Arthur does not want Dutch to be evil. The player often does not want it either. There are moments where you hope he will turn back, listen, soften, admit something. Red Dead Redemption 2 keeps that hope alive just long enough to hurt. Dutch's final failure is not shocking because it comes from nowhere. It is heartbreaking because the player has been watching the chances disappear one by one. The psychology of Dutch Van Der Linde is ultimately the psychology of a man who cannot metabolize failure. Healthy failure becomes learning. Dutch's failure becomes narrative distortion. He cannot say the plan failed because the plan was bad. He says the people lacked faith. He cannot say he misread Micah. He says Arthur is doubting. He cannot say the outlaw age is ending. He says they need one more score. Every failure is converted into fuel for the next failure. This pattern is why the story feels inevitable on replay. At first, you may think the gang falls because of bad luck. On replay, you see Dutch choosing the same psychological escape routes again and again. The details change, but the pattern remains. Humiliation, speech, escalation, doubt, accusation, loyalty test, grief, blame, new plan. The collapse is not sudden, it is rhythmic, and still, Dutch is not empty. That is the final sting. When he speaks kindly to Arthur early on, some part of it is real. When he saves people, some part of him wants to save people. When he mourns Hosea, he mourns. When he shoots Micah, something like recognition moves through him. Dutch is a tragedy because the better man inside him is not absent. He is simply not strong enough to defeat the ego that learned to speak in his name. That may be why Dutch's story feels so haunting after the credits. Players remember his speeches, but they also remember the silences. Arthur looking at him after Gloria, Dutch pausing on this mountain, Dutch saying nothing after shooting Micah, Dutch standing at the edge years later. The speeches build the myth. The silences reveal the man trapped under it. If Dutch had been able to say one honest sentence at the right time, the story might have changed. I was wrong. I am scared. Hosea would have stopped me. Arthur, I should have listened. John, go with your family. Molly, I failed you. Eagle flies. I used your anger. One honest sentence might not save everyone, but it would puncture the delusion. Dutch cannot say it. That inability is his doom. The gang dies because Dutch cannot grieve honestly, cannot fail honestly, cannot lead humbly, and cannot love without needing control. His psychological collapse is not madness in the simple sense. It is the gradual victory of self-protection over reality. Every time reality hurts him, he chooses the story. By the end, the story has eaten the family it was meant to protect. There is also something important in the way Dutch dresses, speaks, and places himself. He is not visually built like a desperate outlaw hiding in the mud, even when the gang is starving. He carries himself like a gentleman revolutionary. The vest, the watch chain, the dark coat, the polished way he moves through camp, the books he keeps near him, the educated phrases in his speeches, all of it creates a performance of superiority. Dutch does not only want to be outside civilization, he wants to stand above civilization, looking down at it like a man who understands its fraud better than anyone else. That is part of his appeal. He gives poor, hunted, wounded people the feeling that they are not merely losing, they are seeing through the world. That feeling can be powerful medicine for people who have been humiliated by society. Arthur was picked up as a lost boy. John was pulled from a brutal childhood. Tilly escaped the Foreman brothers. Mary Beth is a thief with a talent for stories. Reverend Swanson is broken by addiction and shame. Uncle hides from usefulness behind laziness and jokes. So many people in the gang carry some private wound that respectable society would either punish, ignore, or mock. Dutch gives them a different meaning. He says they are not trash. They are free spirits. They are not failures. They are rebels. They are not unwanted. They are family. Psychologically, that is a tremendous gift, and it explains why the gang's loyalty is not foolish at first. Dutch gives people dignity when no one else does, but the same gift becomes a trap when the giver begins needing worship in return. Dutch does not simply offer dignity, he becomes the doorway through which dignity must pass. If the gang believes in Dutch, they are special. If they doubt Dutch, they are betraying the very story that saved them from shame. That is why leaving him feels so difficult for characters like Arthur and John. They are not merely disagreeing with the leader, they are pulling away from the man who helped name them as human beings. Dutch's power is emotional before it is tactical. The camp layout quietly supports this. Dutch's tent is usually central, decorated, marked by books, gramophone music, papers, and small signs of refinement. It is not only a place to sleep, it is a little throne room disguised as a tent. People walk to him, people report to him, people wait near him for judgment, blessing, instruction, or reassurance. Even when the gang pretends to be a loose family, its emotional gravity bends toward Dutch. Hosea can advise, Arthur can enforce, Miss Grimshaw can organise, Pearson can cook, and Strauss can keep the ledger, but Dutch holds the symbolic centre. When that centre rots, the whole camp starts feeling sick. His name even carries a kind of odd double quality. Dutch sounds informal, almost friendly, but Van der Linde sounds old, European, a little grand. The full name feels like the man himself, part campfire companion, part self-made aristocrat, part outlaw philosopher. He is comfortable drinking with thieves, but also wants to sound like he has read the soul of history. He wants rough freedom and refined recognition at the same time. That contradiction lives everywhere in him. He despises rich men, but he enjoys sounding above the common crowd. He rejects polite society, but he wants to be admired like a statesman. He hates hierarchy when it is used against him, but he builds his own hierarchy with himself at the top. Dutch is often compared to Colm O'Driscoll because both are gang leaders, but the comparison shows what makes Dutch more psychologically dangerous. Colm is cruel in an obvious way. He uses men, throws them away, and seems to understand loyalty mostly as manpower. Dutch is warmer, smarter, and more poetic. He does not merely command men to die for him. He convinces them their deaths may mean something. Colm can frighten people. Dutch can enchant them. A frightened man may run when he sees a chance. An enchanted man may stay even while the ground is opening under his feet. Cornwall is another mirror. Dutch hates Cornwall because Cornwall represents the moneyed machine crushing the world he loves. But Dutch and Cornwall share a hidden similarity. Both can reduce people into pieces on a board. Cornwall does it with wages, guards, railroads, oil and Pinkertons. Dutch does it with loyalty, speeches, revenge, and promised freedom. One speaks the language of business, the other speaks the language of rebellion, but both can become blind to the individual person standing in front of them. Arthur becomes useful muscle, Eagle flies becomes useful anger, Molly becomes a problem to manage, John becomes a threat to authority, Abigail becomes an inconvenience. The tragedy is that Dutch hates being treated as disposable by the powerful, then slowly makes other people disposable inside his own cause. Agent Milton is a colder mirror still. Milton believes the age of outlaws is over, and he does not need romance to justify himself. He is smug, brutal, and legalistic, but he is not confused about what he is. Dutch, by contrast, wraps violence in spiritual language. Milton says the state is coming. Dutch says freedom is waiting. Milton threatens. Dutch inspires. Yet both men pressure Arthur from opposite sides of the same dying world. Milton tells Arthur Dutch is finished. Dutch tells Arthur faith will save them. Arthur's pain comes from realizing the cruel outsider may understand Dutch's collapse more clearly than the beloved father does. Rain's Fall reveals another contrast. He is a leader under terrible pressure, but his instinct is restraint. He has lost so much and still tries to keep his people from being consumed by revenge. Dutch looks at that suffering and sees opportunity. Rain's Fall carries grief with humility. Dutch carries humiliation with fire. Eagle Flies becomes the place where these two kinds of leadership collide. Rain's Fall wants his son alive more than he wants a dramatic gesture. Dutch wants the army distracted and his own story revived. The difference between the two men is not that one has suffered and the other has not. The difference is what each man believes suffering permits him to do. Arthur becomes the strongest mirror because Arthur learns the lesson Dutch refuses. Arthur begins as a man who has done terrible things for the gang, but his illness strips away the illusion that he has endless time to be someone else later. Tuberculosis forces him into moral clarity. Dutch, under pressure, runs deeper into fantasy. Arthur gets smaller in the best way. He stops needing to win history. He wants John, Abigail and Jack to live. He wants some debts forgiven. He wants a few people helped before the dark comes. Dutch cannot bear that kind of small goodness. To him, small goodness feels like defeat. To Arthur, by the end, his small goodness is the only victory left that means anything. That is one reason the plan becomes so haunting. The plan is never just a plan. It is Dutch's emotional object, the thing he holds up whenever reality becomes unbearable. After a death, there is a plan. After a failure, there is a plan. After a betrayal, there is a plan. After a warning, there is a plan. The plan does not need detail because its function is not practical detail. Its function is relief. It gives Dutch a way to keep moving without feeling grief fully. It gives the gang a way to postpone despair. As long as there is a plan, the family is not dying. As long as there is one more score, the last score did not fail. As long as Tahiti exists in language, the mud and blood of the present can be endured. His language changes as the story darkens. Early Dutch can sound generous, playful, and expansive. He speaks as if there is room in the world. Later, his language tightens. Faith becomes demand. Loyalty becomes test, doubt becomes poison. The same voice that once made people feel seen begins making them feel watched. This is one of the most believable parts of his decline. People do not always change their vocabulary completely when they fall apart. Sometimes the old beautiful words remain, but the emotional temperature beneath them changes. Family becomes pressure, freedom becomes obedience, love becomes proof, hope becomes denial. It is worth being careful with labels. Dutch can be talked about through narcissism, paranoia, cult-like leadership, moral injury, denial, and grandiosity. But none of those words alone contains him. He is not interesting because he fits one neat diagnosis. He is interesting because the story lets many traits overlap without turning him into a case file. He is charming and manipulative. He is brave and vain. He is loving and controlling. He is politically perceptive and personally delusional. He is wounded by real injustice and guilty of creating new injustice around himself. The psychological truth is not that Dutch is secretly one simple thing. The psychological truth is that people can be many real things at once, and the worst parts can learn to speak with the voice of the best. That is why Dutch can still be beloved even after everything. The affection does not come from ignoring his crimes. It comes from the memory of what he was able to awaken in others before his ego poisoned it. When he is at his best, he makes the world feel less lonely. He laughs with people. He protects people. He gives Arthur a father, Hosea partner, John a second chance, and the lost a campfire to return to. His warmth is not fake in the simple sense. If it were fake, the story would be easier. The heartbreak comes because the warmth is real, and still not enough. Dutch also shows how dangerous it can be when a person confuses being understood with being obeyed. He wants the gang to understand him, but only in a way that confirms him. Arthur understands him too well by the end, and that becomes intolerable. Hosea understands him too well, which is why Hosea's death is so destabilizing. John understands enough to want distance. Abigail understands enough to fear him. Molly understands that his love has moved away from her. But she has no safe language to survive that knowledge. The people closest to Dutch become dangerous to him because they can see the gap between the legend and the man. Micah survives in that gap because Micah does not ask Dutch to be better. Micah asks Dutch to be stronger, meaner, freer from guilt. That is exactly the temptation Dutch needs when shame becomes too heavy. A person trying to avoid guilt will often prefer the company of someone who calls guilt weakness. Micah gives Dutch permission to stop hearing the moral voices around him. He flatters the version of Dutch that wants to believe compassion has become a burden. That is why Micah's influence feels so poisonous. He does not create Dutch's flaws, but he gives those flaws a room with a locked door and tells them they are kings. By the time Dutch walks away from Arthur, the central relationship of his life has inverted. Arthur once existed as proof of Dutch's goodness. Here was the boy he raised, the man who believed, the son who enforced the dream. But dying Arthur becomes proof of Dutch's failure. He sees too much. He says too much. He asks for too much truth. Saving Arthur would mean saving the witness who can name what Dutch has become. So Dutch leaves. It is horrifying because it is quiet. There is no grand speech that can cover it. The father simply chooses not to be a father. Years later, when Dutch steps out on Mount Hagen, the silence around him feels like the remains of all those speeches. He has no gang to perform for. no camp to command, no Tahiti to promise, no Hosea to argue with, no Arthur to wound, no Molly to ignore, no young men gathered around the fire waiting for words. There is only John, Micah, Sadie, the money, the snow, and the old question of who Dutch really is when the audience is gone. He shoots Micah, but he does not explain himself. Maybe he cannot. Maybe explanation would make the act smaller. Maybe he knows nothing he says could repair the years behind him. So he leaves the money and walks away like a man who has finally discovered that survival is not the same as redemption. In the first Red Dead Redemption, Dutch feels like the ghost of his own philosophy. The charm is thinner, the bitterness sharper, the end closer. He still speaks about nature, civilization, and the impossibility of change, but there is almost no family left in the words. What remains is the world view without the warmth. That is a frightening thing. In the old gang, Dutch's ideas were softened by stew, songs, jokes, chores, romances, arguments, and the ordinary life of camp. Later, without that human texture, the ideology stands bare. It is lonely, fatalistic, and exhausted. He sounds like a man who has spent years defending his choices to himself and has finally mistaken that defense for wisdom. His final moments with John complete the psychological circle. John was once the son who would not settle comfortably into Dutch's control. He left, returned, doubted, and eventually chose his own family. Dutch could read that as betrayal because independence feels like rejection to him, but John's independence is also the thing Dutch claimed to want for everyone. Freedom should mean John can walk away. Freedom should mean Jack can grow up outside the gang's violence. Freedom should mean Abigail can demand a future not built on Dutch's pride. Dutch cannot accept that, because the freedom he preached was always tangled with the need to remain central. He wanted people free from the world, but not free from him. So when Dutch says that people do not change, it sounds at first like a universal truth, but it is also a confession. He is speaking from inside his own prison. Arthur changes, John changes, Sadie changes, Charles keeps choosing decency in a brutal world. Abigail fights for a life beyond survival. Jack becomes the haunted remainder of everyone's choices. Dutch says people do not change because he cannot bear the evidence that some people do, and that he did not. His philosophy becomes a shield against the shame of stagnation. The real sorrow is that Dutch had chances. Not one chance, but many. He could have listened to Hosea. He could have taken Arthur's fear seriously. He could have let John go. He could have refused Micah's flattery. He could have stepped back after Blackwater, after Sean, after Bronte, after Hosea, after Guama, after Molly, after Eagle Flies, after Cornwall, after Abigail. Again and again, the story gives him a door toward humility. Again and again, he chooses the door marked destiny. That repetition is what makes his downfall feel earned. He is not struck by a single lightning bolt of madness. He practices denial until denial becomes character. And yet the beauty of the Van der Linde dream should not be erased just because Dutch fails it. The dream matters because it gives the tragedy weight. A camp of unwanted people trying to survive together outside a cruel economy is not an ugly idea. Sharing food, rescuing each other, rebuilding chosen family, distrusting the rich men who buy law-like property, refusing to believe that civilization is automatically moral. Those instincts have real human force. Dutch's failure does not prove that all rebellion is vanity. It proves that rebellion without humility can become another form of domination. A leader can speak against chains while slowly becoming one. That is why Dutch Van Der Linde remains one of the most psychologically layered figures in Red Dead Redemption. He is not frightening because he is a monster from the beginning. He is frightening because he is recognizable. He shows how charisma can begin as shelter and become weather no one can escape. He shows how love can be real and still possessive. He shows how ideals can be sincere and still corrupted by pride. He shows how a man can hate exploitation while exploiting loyalty, hate betrayal while betraying trust, hate civilization's lies while building his own kingdom of beautiful lies beside the fire. The psychological analysis of Dutch Van Der Linde ends there, in that gap between speech and silence. He was a man who built a family with words, held it together with words, deceived himself with words, and finally reached a moment where words could no longer save him. The gang did not die only because the law found them. It died because the man at the center could not tell the truth without losing himself. The saddest thing about Dutch is that somewhere inside him, the dream was beautiful. A place for the unwanted. A family outside the cruelty of respectable society. A refusal to let banks, industrialists, run and government men define the worth of human beings. That dream is why Arthur loved him. It is why Hosea stayed. It is why so many people followed him into snow, swamps, cities, islands, caves, and death. But a beautiful dream in the hands of a man who cannot admit fault becomes dangerous. Dutch wanted freedom, but he could not free the people he loved from himself. That is the psychological law of Dutch Van Der Linde. Not a simple mask falling away, but a slow war between vision and ego, love and control, faith and denial. He begins as the voice keeping people warm in the snow, and ends as the silence walking away from a dying sun. And somewhere between those two images, the entire Van Der Linde gang disappears.